what you're about to see and hear in this episode is entirely new. I believe this is the most important thing that's ever been discussed on Still Mormon. The following presentation was given live on July 12th, 2025. The subject matter is related to the authenticity, reliability, and provenance of the Kingsbury copy of the Celestial Plural Marriage Revelation. This presentation represents new and important research pertaining to the most important document in Mormon polygamy history. Very recently, I and my fellow research partners, Rob Fotheringham and Michael Hamill, discovered information about the Celestial Plural Marriage Revelation that, to our knowledge, has never been discussed before. We hope that you will enjoy and benefit from this presentation, and that this will be the beginning of a new conversation about the history of early Mormon polygamy. But before we discuss the discovery, we need to start with the story of the Revelation. The whole controversy over whether or not Joseph Smith actually practiced polygamy really comes down to one thing. Did he actually receive a revelation on the subject or not? You see, Joseph denied that he did during his lifetime, and he published his denial in the newspaper. Hyrum Smith, during his lifetime, specifically denied that there was a revelation on polygamy and published his denial in the newspaper. Emma Smith denied consistently until the day she died that Joseph had ever received a revelation on polygamy. Of all the people involved in this story, those three, Joseph, Emma, and Hyrum, they would be the primary people to know the truth. If the traditional consensus narrative about the celestial marriage revelation, today known as Doctrine and Covenants section 132, is correct, then there's no escaping the fact that Joseph, Hyrum, and Emma lied, brazenly, boldly, consistently. The consensus narrative today basically holds that what Joseph, Hyrum, and Emma said was not true. But here's the question we should ask. Have their statements, claims, and bold denials been thoroughly examined? Is the consensus view on them correct? What if there were new information that sheds entirely new light on what they said? Would it be worth examining? History professor Dr. David Miano has something important to say about when historical consensus meets with new information.
A consensus in general is what most experts on a subject believe to be true about a certain issue, based on their collective analysis of all the evidence that they have at their disposal. In other words, it is the collective answer of historians to a particular question. But some might say, and some have, well, wait a minute, the consensus has been wrong before, you know. Yes, it has. Many times. People make mistakes. People have biases. In fact, we should expect that the consensus will be wrong again. History, archaeology, science do not claim to be always right. These fields not only expect revision and adaptation, they require it. They must change. I mean, think about it. A historian studies documents and finds something that hasn't been noticed before. Ooh, they share it, and opinions change. An archaeologist finds something in the ground. New things are learned. Opinions change. That is what is supposed to happen. Changing your opinion in the face of new evidence is about the most honest thing that you can do.
Thank you, Professor. Today, we will show you something that hasn't been noticed before. We're going to share what we've learned in hopes that opinions will change. Today, we're looking at the fundamental premise behind the fundamental argument, whether Joseph had a revelation on plural marriage or not. That premise comes down to one single document, sometimes referred to as the Kingsbury copy. You could say that the entirety of this narrative rests on that single document, the Kingsbury copy, known today as Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. The Kingsbury copy has been defended vigorously by some authors and historians.
And then we have the actual Kingsbury copy. You can go to the Church History Library. It was on display. You can go to the Joseph Smith Papers Project and you'll find it there. You can look at it all. There's nothing to make you think that this is a forgery. It's in Kingsbury's handwriting. And then we have later accounts, affidavits from Clayton saying this is an accurate copy of the revelation I wrote down on the 12th. And Kingsbury saying, yes, this is an accurate copy. So, I mean, this document, this 8-page document, it's got 3,000 plus words. It has a wonderful provenance.
One of the claims I've heard is that there was a lot of change from Brigham Young, that he had X'd out a lot of things and added in a lot on section 132, that it's mostly his writing or a big portion of his writing. Is there anything to that?
No, it's wishful thinking on the part, I think, of the denialists, because the document is there. You can look at it. We have samples of Kingsbury's writing that you can compare. These eyewitnesses, short of being bald-faced liars, are giving us a really solid document showing Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage. Very few documents have as good a provenance as this Kingsbury copy of section 132.
The historians at the Joseph Smith Papers Project say this about the Kingsbury copy, quote, "The document's Nauvoo history, its early Utah docket, and its inclusion in the Revelations collection indicate continuous institutional custody." But here's the problem. That's not quite accurate. In fact, it's not accurate at all. Provenance, institutional custody, or chain of custody. You might have heard those terms. What is provenance? Merriam-Webster defines it as the history of ownership of a valued object or work of art or literature. The principle of chain of custody is closely related to provenance. In the legal profession, that principle is paramount. Here's the definition. Chain of custody in legal contexts is the chronological documentation or paper trail that records the sequence of custody, control, transfer, analysis, and disposition of materials, including physical or electronic evidence. The chain of custody is the most critical process of evidence documentation. It is necessary to assure the court of law that the evidence is authentic. Okay, so chain of custody is very important. It could be said that establishing solid chain of custody with historical documents, given that they come from decades or hundreds or thousands of years in the past, can be far more challenging than proving chain of custody in modern legal cases. But difficult as it may be, the principle still applies and the necessity of it is still paramount. The more chronological documentation or paper trail that can be established to prove the authenticity of an artifact or document, the more reliable the document becomes. That's why the Joseph Smith Papers use the phrase continuous institutional custody in relation to the Kingsbury document, because that phrase holds weight. But the problem is there is no chronological documentation or paper trail for that document. None, prior to 1852. What has been relied on to claim that that document has good provenance and continuous institutional custody is a story told over 9 years after the supposed event. We all must rely on that story and 2 corroborating stories in order to establish the chain of custody for the Kingsbury document, because the original was claimed to have been burned by Emma. So that original doesn't exist, and there is no record of the copy being made at the time. The first time the copy of the Revelation was ever acknowledged was when Brigham Young spoke at a special conference on August 29, 1852. Orson Pratt had just spoken to a crowd of around 2,000 saints, speaking for the first time publicly on the doctrine of plurality of wives, claiming Joseph had received a revelation on that subject. Brigham Young also spoke. His words were printed 2 weeks later in the Deseret News on September 14, 1852. Here's what he said.
You heard Brother Pratt state this morning that a revelation would be read this afternoon which was given previous to Joseph's death. It contains a doctrine a small portion of the world is opposed to, but I can deliver a prophecy upon it. Though that doctrine has not been practiced by the elders, this people have believed in it for years. The original copy of this revelation was burned up. William Clayton was the man who wrote it from the mouth of the prophet. In the meantime, it was in Bishop Whitney's possession. He wished the privilege to copy it, which Brother Joseph granted. Sister Emma burnt the original. The reason I mention this is because that the people who did know of the revelation suppose it is not now in existence. The revelations will be read to you. I am now ready to proclaim it. This revelation has been in my possession many years, and who has known it? None but those who should know it. I keep a patent lock on my desk, and there does not anything leak out that should not. It pleases me a little to think how anxious this people are for new revelation. I leave these remarks with you, and we will now have the revelation read.
That was the first time Brigham Young spoke about a copy of the Revelation. Interestingly, he didn't say who had copied it, just that Newell Whitney had wished to have the privilege of copying it. Whitney had died in 1850, 2 years earlier, so he would not be available to corroborate the story. Two other people did confirm Brigham's story about the Revelation. William Clayton in 1871 told his story for the first time in a letter to Madison Scott.
When the Revelation was written, there was no one present except the prophet Joseph, his brother Hyrum, and myself. It took some 3 hours to write it. Joseph dictated sentence by sentence, and I wrote it as he dictated. After the whole was written, Joseph requested me to read it slowly and carefully, which I did, and he then pronounced it correct. The same night, a copy was taken by Bishop Whitney, which copy is now here, and which I know and testify is correct. The original was destroyed by Emma Smith.
Then, in an 1874 affidavit, Clayton swore under oath to the same story, but also added,
Hyrum took the Revelation to read to Emma. Joseph remained with me in the office until Hyrum returned. When he came back, Joseph asked him how he had succeeded. Hyrum replied that he had never received a more severe talking to in his life, that Emma was very bitter and full of resentment and anger. Joseph quietly remarked, I told you, you did not know Emma as well as I did. Towards evening, Bishop Newell K. Whitney asked Joseph if he had any objections to his taking a copy of the Revelation. Joseph replied that he had not, and handed it to him. It was carefully copied the following day by Joseph C. Kingsbury.
Though Clayton had not seen the original, he claimed to have copied a single time after he claimed Emma burned it 31 years earlier. He also said,
The copy made by Joseph C. Kingsbury is a true and correct copy of the original in every respect. The copy was carefully preserved by Bishop Whitney, and but few knew of its existence.
It should be noted that in his Nauvoo journal, he wrote that it was both Joseph and Hyrum, not Hyrum alone, that took the Revelation to Emma. He doesn't mention her burning it, nor Whitney wanting to copy it, nor Kingsbury copying it. The other person to corroborate the story was Joseph Kingsbury himself. He would tell 3 different versions of the story. In his 1870 affidavit, Kingsbury swore under oath,
I wrote the Revelation on celestial or plural marriage from the mouth of Bishop Newell K. Whitney as he read from the original.
Though Kingsbury didn't have the copy of the Revelation because it was in possession of the church, he was able to testify.
The same Revelation that was published in the Deseret News Extra of September 14th, 1852, is a true copy of the original.
Then, on the 22nd of May, 1886, he swore another affidavit. He wrote,
In reference to the affidavit of Elder William Clayton on the subject of the celestial order of patriarchal marriage, published in the Deseret Evening News of May 20th, 1886, and particularly to the statement made therein concerning myself as having copied the original Revelation written by Brother Clayton at the dictation of Prophet Joseph. I will say that Bishop Newell K. Whitney handed me the Revelation above referred to on either the day it was written or the day following, and stating that it was asked me to take a copy of it. I did so, and then read my copy of it to Bishop Whitney, who compared it with the original which he held in his hand while I read to him. When I had finished reading, Bishop Whitney pronounced the copy correct. I will also state that this copy, as also the original, are identically the same as that published in the present edition of the Book of Doctrine and Covenants.
In 1892, Kingsbury was questioned in the Temple Lot court case. This time, he would not swear under oath, but would only affirm his testimony to be true. He then said,
I went into a room by myself and copied it. Well, when I got through making the copy, I took the one I had made myself and read it, and he took the original and read it at the same time to see if I had made any mistakes and that it was correct. And when he found that it was all correct, he took the one that I had made and went out to the door and handed it to Hyrum Smith, who was outside of the door ready to take it.
Kingsbury was asked by the opposing counsel,
State what difference, if any, there is between the Revelation, a copy of which you made, as you have stated, and the Revelation as it was published in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants.
He then replied,
It was the same. It is the same.
He also added a curious detail. Although Clayton claimed it took him 3 hours to write the Revelation as Joseph dictated it, Kingsbury said,
I suppose not more than an hour. Perhaps it took me an hour, and perhaps not over half an hour. I can't remember how long it took me.
Interestingly, in 1848, when he began to write his autobiography, this was just 5 years after the supposed event, he didn't write anything about having copied the revelation, a curious omission for such an important thing to have happened. So, those are the three accounts that make up the story of the celestial plural marriage revelation. The bottom line for the story of the revelation is this. On July 12, 1843, Joseph dictated a revelation, Clayton wrote it down, read it back to Joseph, who pronounced it correct. Kingsbury made an exact copy of Clayton's document. Newell Whitney preserved that document for a few years, then handed it to Brigham Young, probably in winter quarters, and Brigham kept it locked in his desk for many years. Finally, August 29, 1852, he announced it to the world. From Joseph to Clayton to Kingsbury to Whitney to Young. The provenance of the revelation rests almost entirely on that story alone.
Oh, thank you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us here on this impromptu event. I say impromptu because this has come together literally, Mike, how long ago? 3 weeks ago?
A month at the most.
You're going to hear some things tonight that they're brand new. They're brand new to us. Before we dive into it, however, I want to bring my good friend Amberly Peterson up. We need some context before we go into the documents. This is going to be a little wonky. If you don't like documentary history and diving into textual analysis and stuff, you're probably going to fall asleep. But we're going to need to have a little context so that we can understand what we're looking at first. So Amberly's going to come up. She's going to help us understand what was happening at the time of the revelation, and prior to that, about a year and a half prior to August 29th, 1852. Amberly.
All right, so yes, I'm going to present the overview, a brief overview, a high-level overview of the political climate in the Utah Territory between 1850 and 1852. So here we go. When Brigham Young stopped on the benchland above the Salt Lake Valley and famously uttered the words, "This is the place, drive on," he was not in Utah or even in the U.S. He was actually in northern Mexico. The White Star marks approximately where Brigham and the Saints arrived in 1847 and began to settle. Mexico was a logical choice for Brigham and the Saints, who followed him from Nauvoo, as the Mexican government did not actively prosecute polygamists. But life outside of the U.S. was short-lived for the Mormons when, just 6 months later, on February 2, 1848, Mexico ceded 55% of its territory to the U.S. under the terms of the Guadalupe-Hidalgo Treaty, which ended the Mexican-American War. This included what would become the territory of Utah. After being unexpectedly brought back under the jurisdiction of the United States federal government, Brigham Young launched a vigorous 2-year effort to seek statehood for a large area he called the state of Deseret. The status of statehood would give them the power to determine the legality of polygamy in their new state. However, Brigham's petition was rejected by the federal government, and in 1850, Utah was designated as a territory. On September 9th of that year, Brigham Young was appointed territorial governor of Utah and took office on March 4th, 1851. Soon after, President Millard Fillmore appointed 3 federal officers to take their posts in Utah to oversee the governance of the new territory. The 3 appointees arrived between July 17th and 25th of 1851. 2 were federal judges, and the third was a territorial secretary, tasked with delivering $24,000 in gold and the territorial seal to Governor Young. However, the money was withheld by Secretary Harris following a series of acrimonious clashes that erupted soon after their arrival. The primary cause of the conflict centered around the various aspects of the Mormon pioneer community, most notably their open practice of polygamy, which the appointees found reprehensible, and on several occasions the officers publicly denigrated these practices. In his critically acclaimed book on what was called the Mormon conflict, non-LDS scholar and author Norman Furness recounts several documented interactions that reveal outright hostility between the Mormons and the 3 Gentile officers. Mrs. Harris, wife of Secretary Broughton Harris, later expressed her personal disdain for what she witnessed during her short stay with the Mormons in 1851. On Sundays, with nothing to do, we watched the saints file by, each with a long train of wives trailing him. On another occasion, finding herself at tea with 6 of Heber Kimball's wives, she recounts, "On my return home, my pent-up feelings of disgust, indignation, and horror found vent in a severe attack of hysterics, quite frightening to my young husband, who at once decided not to subject me to such a trying ordeal again." But it wasn't just Mrs. Harris that openly expressed her indignation about the open practice of polygamy that she observed. Justice Brockus also, he was one of the 3 officers, also voiced his strong disapproval of the practice by speaking out against it at a general conference in early September 1851, just weeks after his arrival. When he finished, instead of receiving applause, he found himself in imminent peril of an unpleasant death at the hands of an incensed throng of Mormons. It's a quote. According to Furness, who later quoted him as saying, quote, "I feared that the people would spring upon me like hyenas and destroy me," unquote. After he sat down, an angry Brigham Young returned to the podium and spoke of hair pulling and throat cutting, but managed to prevent bloodshed. Later, Brigham said he could have, quote, "loosed the congregation upon Brockus with a gesture of his little finger," unquote, but he satisfied himself with a harsh tongue lashing instead. The other speaker on the stand, Henry Day, an Indian agent, said he was thankful to escape with his life. Within the week, all 3 officers were convinced that they could no longer fulfill their duties in Utah and began making preparations for departure. They made it just 2 months of a multi-year post. On September 19th, Brigham Young suggested that Brockus address the Mormons and explain his earlier remarks. Brockus promptly declined, according to Furness, saying that his earlier remarks needed no further explanation and that he wanted to avoid being assassinated. By the end of September, worried for their safety, the 3 began the long journey back to Washington, D.C. to file a scathing report about their 70 days in Salt Lake with Brigham and the Saints. Notably, none of the 3 officers ever publicly mentioned a revelation or a document about the plurality of wives during their time in Utah, nor after their return home. If it was sitting in Brigham's desk at the time, there is no indication that he or anyone else mentioned it to them in defense of their open practice of polygamy. The runaway officers, as they came to be known, never returned to Salt Lake City. Their posts went unfilled for the next 2 years. Just before the final confrontation with the 3 officers on September 19, 1851, Brigham dispatched John Bernheisel to Washington, D.C., accompanied by Jedediah Grant, in anticipation of the swift and sure legal and political consequences likely to follow from the officers' report. Taking advantage of their head start, Bernheisel and Grant set to work immediately upon their arrival in Washington. By the time the runaways arrived, 3 different versions of their report had already been leaked to national publications. These reports, which were contradictory and painted the officers in a negative light, were rumored to have been planted by Mormon agents. In response to this preemptive PR campaign by Bernheisel and Grant, the officers published their official report, which included 10 serious accusations of things they had witnessed in Utah, which they submitted to President Millard Fillmore on December 19. Item number 7 on the list was, quote, openly sanctioning and defending the practice of polygamy or plurality of wives, unquote. With the report on President Fillmore's desk, the government began deliberating on how to handle the Mormons. The debate continued throughout the rest of 1851 and into the summer of 1852. During that time, it is reported that Bernheisel, quote, was ubiquitous, counseling President Fillmore and his cabinet, championing his Mormon people's rights in the House of Representatives, and arranging the publication of appropriate literature, unquote. A portion of that literature was written by this man, Jedediah Grant. He would later earn the nickname Brigham's Sledgehammer for both his loyalty to Brigham Young and his aggressive approach in defending the church and its teachings. At this time in early 1852, he was the mayor of Salt Lake City, a president of the Quorum of the 70, and a husband to 7 plural wives. Shortly after he and Bernheisel arrived in Washington, D.C., he wrote 3 letters to the New York Herald and asked them to publish them, quote, as soon as you can. They granted his request and published the first of 3 on March 9, 1852. On the right, you will see Grant's summation of the 10 charges from the officer's report. Notice next to the yellow star, charge 7 reads, quote, openly sanctioning and defending the practice of polygamy or the plurality of wives. On the left, in this slide, you see Grant's response, and next to each charge, he labels as false and then calls for a trial. Notice his response to number 7 on the upper right side. In the original report, the officers actually linked the practice of polygamy with murder because they claimed 2 murders occurred that had a direct connection to polygamy. But Grant claims not guilty of either murder or polygamy. Then under the statement, he elaborates on the polygamy charge, saying, quote, "Now, let me take up the charge of polygamy and Governor Young with his score of wives and sucking baby apiece. I pronounce it false and call for the proofs. Who are the other polygamists? Our delegate and myself? We are here and we brand it as a lie." However, not only did Jedediah have 7 plural wives at the time, but so did John Bernheisel. And Brigham Young had over 50 wives by this date, according to several accounts in 1852. It is unclear why Grant made demonstrable false claims in a national publication with these outright denials, but it is reasonable to conclude that this put Brigham and the Saints in a precarious position. In seeking to be exonerated of the charges in the officer's report, polygamy was being repeatedly denied in the press by one of their own, who ironically was an active polygamist. On May 1st, Grant, still beating the drums of denial, writes one final letter to President Fillmore himself and includes a copy of his 3 letters to the New York Herald and asks him to read them. Toward the end of his letter, he emphatically declares, "We contradict every single statement of the delinquent officers and will rejoice to prove their falsehood." Then he calls for an examination under oath and declares, "Our last cut cry is trial." Well, by June of 1852, the debate in Washington had eased somewhat, but in Utah, a new strategy was forming. Since statehood was not feasible at the time, which would have given Brigham the authority as governor to defend polygamy, he and the 12 turned to the only remaining option, the First Amendment of the Constitution, which explicitly prevents the government from interfering with religious practices, provided certain conditions, as laid out in the religious clauses, the First Amendment, are met. Although written in modern vernacular, the following describes the criteria for protection under the religious clauses of the United States Constitution in 1852 and remains valid today. It's very brief and it says this: "The religion clauses extend only to sincere religious activities, and in evaluating constitutional claims, the government may investigate whether a person's beliefs are insincere and whether they are secular, stemming from political, sociological, or philosophical views, rather than religious beliefs. However, providing the proper evidence to meet the governor's requirement would pose a challenge for Brigham, given Jedediah Grant's published denials boldly asserting that the Mormons were not practicing the very thing they now sought protection for. This public paradox they found themselves mired in would require skillful navigation, and Brigham knew just the one who could handle it: Orson Pratt, a great thinker and gifted orator. During the special conference held on August 29, 1852, when the revelation on the plurality of wives was read publicly for the first time, Orson spoke for most of the morning session, outlining the biblical and doctrinal foundations of the revelation. However, and more importantly, before he dives into the doctrinal aspects, he begins with a curious admission that at first blush seems to fly in the face of Grant's numerous loud denials, but a closer look reveals an important nuance. He says, "It is well known, however, to the congregation before me that the Latter-day Saints have embraced the doctrine of a plurality of wives as a part of their religious faith. It is not, as many have supposed, a doctrine embraced by them to gratify the carnal lusts and feelings of man. That is not the object of the doctrine." Notice how he carefully concedes that the saints have merely practiced the doctrine, embraced the doctrine, not that they have practiced it. The nuance between practice and embrace is small but significant, and it lies in the transition from belief to practice. A people can embrace an ideal without practicing it. So his skillful wording allows him to stand on Jedediah Grant's published denials of the practice, while simultaneously conceding their embrace of the doctrine, a doctrine he is quick to point out that is not rooted in the carnal lusts of man. So, to an outsider, Pratt appears to be constructing a theological bridge for his congregation to walk over that spanned the chasm between embracing the doctrine and putting it into practice. Looking back, this seems somewhat curious since a large contingent of the congregation sitting in front of Orson Pratt that day had already crossed that bridge years earlier. In fact, many of them before they ever crossed the plains. In view of that, it seems reasonable to wonder who Pratt's target audience was that day: the Mormons in Utah or the feds in Washington? Another layer of Pratt's opening statement that adds to the question of who his remarks were actually directed at is how he seems to address the religious clause requirements as if checking a set of predetermined boxes. So here's the chart. On the left, we have what I read from the religion clauses from the U.S. government and what Orson Pratt started out with that I already read. And you can see that there's high correspondence between what they require and what he makes a point to say, right? So in the yellow, sincere religious activities. Well, here's him saying, here's Orson Pratt, the doctrine of plurality of wives, as a part of their religious faith. So he's making that connection. It is not to gratify the carnal lusts and feelings of man. Hence, they seem secular. So in his next paragraph, Orson abandons all subtlety and goes straight at the matter with clear and bold language to make the case for the constitutional protection they are seeking for polygamy as part and portion of their religion when he proclaims, quote, "We shall endeavor to set forth before this enlightened assembly some of the causes why the Almighty has revealed such a doctrine." Just notice this really deep theological language he's including. "And why it is considered a part and portion of our religious faith. And I believe that they will not, under our present form of government, I mean the government of the United States, try us for treason for believing and practicing our religious notions and ideas. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the Constitution gives the privilege to all the inhabitants of this country of the free exercise of their religious notions and the freedom of their faith and the practice of it. Then, if it can be proven to a demonstration that the Latter-day Saints have actually embraced as part and portion of their religion the doctrine of a plurality of wives, it is constitutional. And should there ever be laws enacted by this government to restrict them from the free exercise of this part of their religion, such laws must be constitutional." Notice in the last sentence, he says, if it can be proven that the Latter-day Saints have actually embraced the doctrine. Again, Pratt avoids any admission that they actually have been practicing the doctrine to stay in accord with Grant's public denials, especially his most recent one made to the President of the United States, just 3 months prior to the conference. From there, Pratt delves into the exposition of the doctrinal points intended to lay a foundation for the content of the revelation itself to be read later that day. But this set the stage for Brigham in the afternoon session to pick up where Pratt and Grant left off by adding his witness to the denials and supplying the all-important provenance and timeline of the revelation that Jeremy pointed out, as they add significant gravitas to their case for establishing polygamy as a sincere religious belief traced back to their founding prophet. So Jeremy put this up there, and it's hard to read, but basically I want to just grab a couple pieces because he said 3 things in these short words here. They're super significant to this. So you heard Brother Pratt state this morning, the revelation would be read this afternoon, which was given previous to Joseph's death. That's important. It contains a doctrine a small portion of the world is opposed to, but I can deliver a prophecy upon it. Though that doctrine has not been preached by the elders, this people have believed in it for many years. So, this people have believed in it for many years. He hits a second box. The original copy of this revelation was burned up. William Clayton was the man who wrote it from the mouth of the prophet. So, number 3, it was recorded from the mouth of the prophet. So, through this whole speech, though the whole speech is very brief, it's just that one paragraph provides 3 significant statements to bolster the Mormons' case for First Amendment protection. Curiously, in this, the Desert News account that I literally took a screenshot of, Brigham does not deny that polygamy was being practiced at the time, only that the elders had not preached it. In the Journal of Discourses version, he claims it wasn't practiced. Not sure why there's the difference, but more importantly, and very strategically, here's the point. By unveiling the revelation on that date, Brigham established August 29, 1852 as a symbolic starting point, the official start date, as it were, for the practice of polygamy, signaling to the federal government that the figurative bridge between embracing the principle and practicing it was fully built, and the Mormons would be making that transition. History would show this to be a brilliant tactical move, as it provided them ostensible cover from potential prosecution for the next 2 decades, while their battle with the government for First Amendment protections limped along. Similarly, by tying the original date of the revelation to a time previous to Joseph's death, Brigham effectively backdates the pardon that they are seeking for any polygamy charges that could be brought against them for the previous 9 years, going back to July 12, 1843. Thus, this historic announcement offers them protection from legal recrimination, going both forward and backward in time, as long as they can convince the federal government that polygamy is a sincere religious practice based on a genuine religious belief. Okay, one more thing I'd like to highlight from Orson's speech, and then I'll be done. On August 29th, one more thing from Orson's speech on August 29th that I would like to highlight. In his opening salutation upon taking the stand that morning, Orson says this, quote, "It is quite unexpected to me, brethren and sisters, to be called upon to address you this forenoon, and still more so to address you upon the principle which has been named namely a plurality of wives. However, that statement is a little bit problematic because documented meetings, there are documented meetings that Orson Pratt participated in the weeks leading up to August 29, 1852, that suggest he may not have been as surprised as he sounded. In a BYU Scholars Archive paper by Jake Simmons, we learn this: though apparently surprised to be speaking on the subject, polygamy was not a new or even uncomfortable concept for Pratt. In addition to his history with the concept discussed previously, he had several occasions on which to contemplate the doctrine during the weeks prior to the 29 August meeting. This is important. During several quorum meetings, church leaders opened Joseph Smith's 1843 revelation on celestial marriage, now published in the Doctrine and Covenants of section 132, which dealt with many things, including plural marriage, to serious and lengthy discussion. On Sunday, 8 August 1852, 13 of the leading brethren listened as Secretary Thomas Bullock read the revelation, after which they discussed it in great detail. 1 week later, on 15 August, several church leaders, including Pratt, again met to discuss the principle of plurality. So did you get this? Meetings were happening starting on August 8th. It was read in a meeting, 13 people there, and again the next week. Whether Orson was genuinely surprised or not, we can't say for sure. But what we can say is that he and 13 of the leading brethren spent 3 weeks in serious and lengthy discussions about it before unveiling it to the world at the special conference on August 29th of 1852.
Isn't she great? So Amberly is one of my writing partners from an upcoming book on William Clayton, tentatively and currently called The Clayton Conundrum, which will have some groundbreaking stuff in it, actually. Stuff never before revealed or released. And the reason this is all happening today is because of other writing partners. Mike Hamill's one, you'll hear from him in a minute. And research partners. Rob Fotheringham, anybody know his stuff? Okay, good. So Rob and Mike are responsible for this material today. So if it goes bad, it's their fault. It's really their fault. And I'll tell you a little bit about how this came to be. But I want to thank Justin and Rebecca Griffin. Thank you so much for allowing this to happen. I love you guys. Don't cry. Don't. You're not allowed to cry. Okay. And thank you all. Good heavens, what a crowd. Anybody here watch Still Mormon? Do you guys watch the show? Oh, wow. Okay. That's great. This is going to be a little bit of a weave. You need some context. That's why I brought Amberly up first. You need to understand what's going on at the time. I want to give you a little bit more context as we dive into the documents. Then I'm going to bring Mike up, and he's going to help me explain a portion of it, and then I'll wrap up. First, sometimes when we can get a view of things about what we think we know from a different perspective, when we notice new details, new features, new lines and contours of the pictures we have in our minds, of the way things are, an entirely new picture can then sometimes emerge. And the aim today is to see if we can get a new picture in our minds. But first, before we dive further into the Revelation story, there's some other context that we need to have. First, this is something I've been endeavoring to do on my show, is to lay out the contemporaneous history related to Joseph Smith and plural marriage. I believe that before you claim you have an understanding of that subject, you have to have a thorough understanding of what happened during his lifetime so you can assess all of the evidence. And that, in my opinion, that work has not been done. That's part of the historical method that I believe has been actually neglected in this regard. The Prices began that work, David and Pamela Price, in their book, Joseph Smith Fought Polygamy, their series. But it hasn't been done thoroughly. And so I'm endeavoring to do that. I just wrote a paper that has stirred the hornet's nest in that regard, because there's new information, I believe, that needs to be considered in the contemporaneous record about what was going on in England, for example. But in the year and a half, roughly, prior to Joseph Smith's death, there was a lot going on that most people aren't really aware of the fight, the outward fight, that Joseph, Emma, and Hyrum engaged in against the practice of spiritual wifery, polygamy, having more than one wife, plurality of wives, any form of polygyny, polygamy, polyandry, spiritual wifery. They made no distinction. I have tried, and I am endeavoring to change the dialogue amongst all scholars and historians when we refer to that time period. What the later Utahns called it, the spiritual wife doctrine. That what they practiced was called the spiritual wife doctrine. Heber Kimball called it that. Brigham Young called it that. Augusta Cobb, his wife, said that we referred to ourselves as spirituals. Helen Kimball said we were all called spiritual wives. Emily Partridge said we were known as spiritual wives. So we ought to be very clear about what we're talking about. Joseph was opposed to that and to all forms, publicly, of having more than one wife. There is not a single record in the contemporaneous record that can establish otherwise. There are nuanced documents that people try to tease out information, things like this Brigham Young Masonic cipher in the Whitney letter and a number of things. But during Joseph, Emma, and Hyrum's life, for example, on May 14th, 1843, Hyrum delivered a scathing sermon at the temple against, using the text of Jacob 2, against all forms of polygamy. He said, look, if an angel comes and preaches this, you're going to know he's a devil, which is interesting in light of the stories of the angel coming to Joseph. On July 16th, Joseph got up and preached a sermon on eternal marriage. The first time I learned about this was actually because of Andy Ehad, who's in the audience, and because I read the words of Joseph Smith, and he documents the notes that were taken on that day, and we have some decent notes from that sermon, and we know a good deal about what he was teaching that day, which Joseph will later confirm in June of 1844. Well, Joseph had actually been preaching this doctrine. If you've seen the show, you're aware, and I've not heard, maybe someone has, and I hope they have, I've not heard any scholar say that Joseph was teaching eternal marriage in 1835. He was teaching it to a group of elders in 1835. We know this from William Phelps because he writes a letter to his wife, Sally. And we learn from William Phelps that the law of the celestial kingdom, according to Joseph, was that you could only have one spouse in the eternities, but that you could have that spouse in the eternities. That their relationships would not end at death. Well, he preaches this sermon on July 16th. Then in August, sometime in August, we don't really know when, Hyrum read that revelation to the High Council. It's this High Council meeting that has caused such a stir and debate about the subject. Then in October, Joseph's walking up and down the street, tells his scribe that no man can have more than one wife, and to try anybody who's doing it. That later gets changed in the history. Then there's a trial against Harrison Sagers. On January 1st, William Law is getting in trouble because he's saying some stuff about Joseph, and he's upset about this, quote, spiritual wife doctrine. And in that meeting, he says, well, I'm okay with Joseph, basically, because he and Hyrum, quote, blowed up, meaning they destroyed or they put down the doctrine in both the High Council and the Elders' Quorum, January 1st. Then we have the excommunication of Hiram Brown that was headed by Joseph and Hyrum. Then we have February 27th, I believe, of 1844 through March about 19, we have the Voice of Innocence erupt. The Voice of Innocence, a lot of people aren't aware, was actually initiated by Joseph Smith. The Voice of Innocence is a scathing rebuke of all forms of polygamy in defense of Hyrum against charges against him by Orsimus F. Bostwick. Joseph initiated a lawsuit against him for defamation, for slander and libel against Hyrum. By the way, Joseph had initiated 3 lawsuits to defend himself and Hyrum, and proposed one to defend Maria Lawrence against accusations of spiritual wifery and polygamy. Ask yourself the question, why would he do that? All it would take is one disgruntled uncle, one neighbor, one former plural wife, because they all had lots of former ones. Why would you subject yourself to cross-examination? Well, he did, often. And then there was and by the way, Joseph organized the meeting where the Voice of Innocence was held, where William Phelps read the letter, and then when Emma stood up in the Relief Society meetings, on 4 consecutive meetings, she said, "These are the words of Joseph Smith." The Voice of Innocence, putting down all forms of polygamy. And then We have the letter to the elders abroad and the letter to China Creek by Hyrum Smith, all condemning plural marriage. We have Joseph's defense of himself against Francis Higbee, where we finally learn what actually happened with John Bennett back in July of 1841, where he says, man, if I'd done things differently, perhaps it wouldn't have gone the way it did, and I will never do that again. Then on April 8th, 1844, a speech that still is not up on the Joseph Smith papers, a speech that ought to be memorized by all of us who want to understand this subject. Hyrum spoke for an hour and a half on the subject, and he decried all forms of spiritual wifery and polygamy. And he said, God has not commanded any man to have more. And he said, I'd rather be friends with the devil than be friends with a man who will preach such stuff. Then on May 26th, after having undergone an indictment against himself by William and Wilson Law for adultery with Maria Lawrence and other unnamed females, Joseph stands up and gives the famous speech that has sometimes been called a careful denial, where he stands up and says, I'd barely been preaching the gospel for 5 minutes when I was accused of having 7 wives. And this spiritual wife nonsense. And how can I be accused of having 7 wives when I can only find one? And then he proposed, actually, to sue William and Wilson Law for slander against Maria Lawrence. He asked John Taylor to go do that. Unfortunately, he was dead by the time that could happen. Just weeks before his death, apparently, these are later stories, but not too late, William Marks said that he had a conversation with Joseph Smith where Joseph Smith said, this polygamy doctrine is going to ruin us. If we keep doing it, we're going to have to leave the country. And I want you to go and pursue charges against all those who are practicing it. I know a lot of people think that means William is admitting Joseph had more than one wife. However, it's what he said. Go try all those who are practicing it. William Smith confirms basically the same, a different conversation, but the substance of the same, that he had a conversation with Emma and Joseph weeks before their death, where Emma said, you know, John Taylor, Brigham Young, and I believe Willard Richards are going around preaching things that are going to ruin the church, William said in reference to polygamy. And Joseph said, well, I will get to them as soon as I get done with the Laws and Fosters. Okay. Then on June 8th and 10th, as the tensions are winding, just after the expositor releases its expose with 3 affidavits, Austin Coles and William and Jane Law, claiming that they had been shown a revelation. Okay? And to some, they have said, this is the smoking gun that purports to be exactly the same as what is in D&C 132. The next day, the city council met, and Joseph and Hyrum, in actually only a small portion of the meeting, because most of it dealt with counterfeiting and the plot against Joseph and his family by the expositor group and Joseph Jackson hiring him and paying him $500 to kill the entire Smith family. That's what was the testimony of 2 people who swore affidavits. Well, in that meeting, both Hyrum and Joseph denied that Austin Coles had told the truth. Hyrum said it had nothing to do with the present time. It only had to do with former days. Joseph said the substance of the revelation only had to do was that a man, would have to be married in view of eternity. He said it was an answer to a question that he'd had about Luke 22, where the Sadducees are coming to the Lord, and they say, what happens if a woman have a husband and he has 7 brothers and he die, and then she marries the next brother and then he die, and so on and so forth? Who is she married to in heaven? And the Lord says, you don't understand. They're neither to marry nor are given in marriage. Okay? They're appointed as angels. And Joseph wanted to know about that. And the answer that he received was, you got to be married here to be married there, in view of eternity. And apparently the substance of the revelation preached something about necessary something to bind them with, some kind of authority. We don't know a lot about it because Joseph didn't give us a lot about it that we have recorded. Well, that's what was going on with them, and that's only just a sketch. There's also some things we need to understand about the man to whom the document, the Kingsbury document, is attributed. Well, you see, Joseph Kingsbury began creating his life history by his own hand in 1846, only 3 years after he supposedly created the only remaining copy of D&C 132. In his autobiography, Kingsbury never mentions making a copy of the Revelation. Now, among other events in his life, Kingsbury mentions being baptized in 1832, being ordained an elder in 1833. In 1835, received a patriarchal blessing from Joseph Smith Sr. He left on a mission to New York that he records, and upon returning 3 months later, being called on to speak to the church by the prophet Joseph. In 1838, he moved his family to Far West, at least in part because, quote, President Joseph Smith and father, Jr. and father and brother were making their way there. And in 1841, we moved his family to Nauvoo, which he referred to as commerce. In March of 1843, Kingsbury recorded a patriarchal blessing given to him by the prophet Joseph, after which the next entry reads, quote, I remained with Newell K. Whitney until 23rd July, 1843, and left Nauvoo. He then went on a mission. That's all he records of his time in Nauvoo. That's it. There's not a single mention of Kingsbury being asked to make the only surviving copy of the Revelation now in D&C 132. Kingsbury didn't mention it all. And remember, he started writing his history in 1846, just 3 years after he supposedly had created that manuscript. If Kingsbury cared enough to include that the prophet Joseph asked him to give a talk in church after his 3-month mission to New York, is it reasonable to believe he would have left out his involvement in creating the only surviving copy of the most impactful revelation in church history if it had actually happened? It should also be noted that Kingsbury was already a polygamist when he wrote his memoir. He had been married legally to Sarah Ann Whitney, Newell Whitney's daughter. She was living with him as his wife until late 1845. He gave her up, however, to Heber Kimball after sometime in 1845, when Sarah was already pregnant with Heber's baby. Kingsbury began to take plural wives before he began his memoir in 1846. And he had been adopted and sealed as a spiritual son to Newell K. Whitney, the very man who supposedly had asked for a copy of the plural marriage revelation. And yet, though a practicing polygamist and a firm believer in the doctrine, he never recorded his pivotal role in the all-important revelation's preservation. For such an important event, this is a glaring omission. Perhaps there is a truly good reason why he never wrote about it. There's also the fact that the Kingsbury story of the revelation changed over time. In 1870, Kingsbury signed an affidavit written by Joseph F. Smith, which claimed that Kingsbury created his manuscript copy of D&C 132 by listening as Bishop Newell Whitney dictated the original out loud. It reads, quote, he wrote the revelation on celestial marriage from the mouth of Newell K. Whitney as he read from the original. But when Kingsbury wrote out the affidavit in 1886, he changed his story, and that the version Newell Whitney handed Kingsbury the original document, and Kingsbury copied it himself. In 1886, Kingsbury wrote, Newell K. Whitney handed me the revelation and asked me to take a copy of it. Also in the 1886 statement, after Kingsbury finished making the copy, Hyrum Smith allegedly came into the room and retrieved the original document. He wrote, quote, Hyrum Smith coming into the room at that time to fetch the original, Bishop Whitney handed it to him. But in his 1892 testimony in the Temple Lot case, Kingsbury changed that aspect of the story too. In that version, he claimed that after he'd finished copying the document, Hyrum didn't come into the room to get the original document back, but stayed outside the room, and that Bishop Whitney delivered the newly created document to Hyrum. In Kingsbury's words, quote, he took the one that I had made and went out to the door and handed it to Hyrum, who was outside the door. Okay, all that could be explained by bad memory, a guy getting old over time. Absolutely. Perhaps also there's a very good reason why the details of his story kept changing over time. Another thing to take note of is that Kingsbury, in every version of his story, indicates that he made the copy in a single sitting. There is no deviation from this point from Kingsbury in his story, and in his 1892 testimony, when asked how long it took him to write it, he said it took him maybe an hour, maybe no more than a half hour, as we heard before. Maybe a little more than an hour, but indicating it took much shorter time than it took Clayton, who said it took him 3 hours. Nevertheless, Kingsbury's testimony in all three tellings was that he copied the revelation in a single sitting. Historian William V. Smith has done great work on this. He tells us the following about a curious feature of the Kingsbury document. By the way, Rob Fotheringham discusses this in depth in one of his videos. Historian Smith says the following, quote, Kingsbury interrupted his copying of Clayton's manuscript after what is now verse 60. It is impossible to know precisely how long the delay was, but some bounds are possible. While the other verses were still transcribed by Kingsbury, the break between the verses is made evident by the use of a different quill and shade of ink. Furthermore, Kingsbury altered his style somewhat after the break, including nearly exclusively the use of ampersand in the later text, as opposed to its complete absence prior to the break, indicating that some time may have passed between his resuming the transcription. So Smith leaves room for the possibility that indeed Kingsbury didn't do it in a single sitting. So, as you can see from the document, the handwriting changes, the ink changes, the writing instrument changes, and the margins change. This is, I believe, not just a possibility, I believe it's strong indication that this did not happen in a single sitting. Could it have happened? Could he have broken his pen? Could he have needed a break? I guess, but then why did it take him 30 minutes to an hour? The story details get murky when we look at them closely. Well, some final context for consideration before we examine the Revelation. Before August 29th, as Amberly painted so clearly, Mormon leaders would deny the practice of plural marriage vehemently. We've already heard what Jedediah Grant said, but John Taylor, in October of 1844, in response to Sidney Rignan's direct accusations, wrote, quote, that the 12 and their adherents, that Sidney Rignan wrote that the 12 and their adherents have endeavored to carry on the spiritual wife business in secret. LDS Apostle John Taylor made a fierce public denial in the Times and Seasons, although he had already been taking plural wives at that point. And then 6 years later, while in France in 1850, Taylor, in a public debate over polygamy, over polygamy accusations against the Mormons, gave a lengthy denial, stating emphatically in part, quote, I proved Mr. Caswell to have told one lie, and a man that will tell one falsehood to injure an innocent people will tell 500, if necessary, for the same object. We are accused here of polygamy and actions the most indelicate, obscene, and disgusting, such that none but a corrupt and depraved heart could have contrived. I shall content myself by reading our views of chastity and marriage from a work published by us containing some of the articles of our faith, the Doctrine and Covenants. Then Taylor held up the Doctrine and Covenants, and then he read section 109 at the time, which contained the article on marriage, which prohibited polygamy. Taylor had as many as 15 wives at the time. In 1864, Taylor admitted why he had lied in 1850 to RLDS Apostle E.C. Briggs, explaining he had made, quote, a prudential statement, for if he had owned himself a polygamist, which he was at the time, he would have been driven out of France and so cut off his usefulness in that country. What, Mr. Taylor, tell a lie, said E.C. Briggs. Yes, said the former, under the circumstances it was justifiable. You heard what Amberly said about what Jedediah Grant said, and you also heard her read Brigham Young's words, which we heard in the beginning as well. But it's interesting to note, he both either said that they didn't preach the doctrine or the elders hadn't practiced the doctrine. Now, whether they hadn't preached it or whether they hadn't practiced it is kind of immaterial. Both of them are untrue. And so, by this time, it's important to note that just as Elder Taylor and Elder Grant had both lied brazenly to conceal the elders' current practice of polygamy, when Brigham Young told the story about the Revelation for the first time, for the very first time to the world, he introduced it with a lie. Keep all of that context in mind as we dive into the documents, because today we're re-examining the Revelation story and looking deeper at those documents, because when we do, they themselves, the documents, tell a fundamentally different tale. What those documents reveal and what the evidence we'll present today shows that at the time Brigham Young told the story for the very first time, August 29th, 1852, there were different versions of the Revelation. The first thing to note is what Young, Clayton, and Kingsbury left out. Young's claim gave the impression that there was a single copy of the Revelation and he had that carefully safeguarded in his desk. What they said gives the impression that this copy made by Joseph Kingsbury would be the source of all subsequent material. Now, historians have known that there have been other copies that were made for a long time. For example, Newell Whitney's son, Horace Whitney, made 2 pristine copies. Horace's wife, the famed Helen Kimball Whitney, claimed her husband made the copies in 1847 in winter quarters. Horace's journal for that time period records that he copied an, quote, important document for his father, although he doesn't say what the document was. Historians have concluded that this was indeed the time he copied the 2 copies of the plural marriage revelation. Now, the one document that we are most interested in is the notable version of the revelation that was recorded by Willard Richards. This version is acknowledged but hardly talked about. We don't know exactly when Richards created his version of the revelation. The Joseph Smith papers says this about the one Willard Richards wrote, quote, Willard Richards made a copy of the Kingsbury version, likely before leaving Nauvoo in 1846, but certainly before 1854 when he died. So the JSP believes it's likely he created the document prior to leaving Nauvoo in 1846. And Brian Hales places the Richards document sometime in late 1843 or 1844. In reality, without more documentation, there's just no way to know exactly when it was written. But there is more we know about the Richards document. But before we get to that, so I learned about this document many years ago, actually, and when I first saw it, I thought, this is really strange. When I read it and I looked at it, it just didn't make sense to me. And the existence of the Richards copy, well, in my mind at the time, it didn't help the Kingsbury story. The fact that the Richards copy existed and exists raises some apparent, to me at least, apparent questions. Like, why would Richards make a copy? For his own personal use, I guess. That's kind of the interpretation of it that people have settled on. But then I looked closely and I noticed years ago, it looked official, not personal. Let me explain what I mean. You can tell a lot about the kind of document you're looking at by the nature of the way it was created. With Richards, he gives us a lot of different examples of the type of document that he's working on, whether he's working on a draft of a letter or in his work as official church historian, creating the church history drafts, or whether he's writing in his personal journal. Just the nature of how he writes and the way he treats the documents tells us a lot about the document and what type of document it is. As would be expected in his personal journal, he's writing very sloppy, very fast, keeping contemporaneous notes. When he's working on the history drafts, for example, it's a little cleaner. As the official church historian, it's neater, cleaner. Often there's insertions and cross-outs. It's a draft, after all, but his handwriting tends to improve. And similarly, as a scribe, when he's drafting a letter, he does the same. This particular letter is the letter written to the Relief Society, March 31st, 1842, a very important letter. Richards would employ his best handwriting, as most clerks would. They would be employed as clerks because they could write cleanly. He would employ his best handwriting for the most official documents, like, for example, the Book of the Law of the Lord, which he kept starting in 1841 for a time. This is a very important official church document. So, well, that's interesting. When you look at the Richards manuscript of the Revelation, the handwriting he employs, just as he does with any other official and important document that he writes, like the Book of the Law of the Lord, with the manuscript of the Revelation, he uses his very best handwriting. And that's interesting to me. I thought, well, this doesn't appear to be just a personal copy. Well, more than noticing just the handwriting, I also noticed all of the official markings. For a non-official document, a personal copy to be marked up such was really odd. Page numbering, pilcrow markings, meaning paragraph markers. You don't put paragraph markers on your personal writings, typically, unless you're going to have them printed or recopied for other purposes. The fact that someone was editing this document in an official capacity, all of those various punctuation, by the way, it has lots of punctuation markings by another person other than Richards, or maybe Richards himself at another time with another pen. Well, you don't put all of those unless you're doing it for print or reproduction in another document, like an official church manuscript, like, for example, the church history. You see that in the history drafts all over the place. They're marking that document up to reproduce it in a clean form. This document here was already quite clean to begin with. Yes, Richard had covered over some of his copy errors. However, he tried to make it as pristine as possible. Well, seeing all those markings on it, we also see that someone came in and wrote pencil edits on the document. There's a number of those pencil edits all over the document. We'll get to those in a minute. So again, I looked at this document and thought, wow, the fact that this looks really official is just strange to me. It didn't make sense, especially in light of the official story. Another question I had was about the timing of the Richards version. If Richards had made it prior to leaving Nauvoo in 1846, I thought, well, why would Brigham Young have not known about it? Richards was his cousin, one of his closest friends, one of the first polygamists, prominent polygamy insider. He was church historian, apostle, eventually counselor in the first presidency. I couldn't conceive that if Richards had made his own personal copy that early, that Brigham would have needed to get a copy from Whitney. It seemed to me that the chances of Richards not sharing that with Brigham Young were next to none. But maybe that's just me. Well, though I couldn't reconcile all of those questions, I put that document aside, figuring I would come back to it later. And just a few weeks ago, talking with Mike and I talk a lot. We're back and forth talking about documents, and it's a lot. And we were talking about the Richards document. And as we were discussing that document, Mike said the following: what if it's a draft? That word hit me. I then went and looked at the document. And I looked at the pencil edits, which, by the way, are edits, as I will show. Then I noticed that the document reads coherently prior to the edits. It's an important point. I checked out the pencil edits, found there was about a dozen. Checked out the Kingsbury. All the pencil edits were in the Kingsbury. There were no edits to the Kingsbury that made their way the other way around. We're going to describe the difference here in a minute between copy errors and drafting edits. That's important. We'll come back to that. Then I explained this to Rob Fotheringham. Mike and I felt like we had discovered something. Didn't know exactly what it meant, but I had to tell somebody, so we told Rob. He didn't get it at first. He thought it was still a copy. He's like, nah, that doesn't make any sense. They could just they could just be trying to reconcile this copy, with the Kingsbury, even if much later. Then he looked at the document, and he saw the same thing. He was excited. He said, I found 11 instances that support your hypothesis. And then he said, did you see that date on the back? I said, oh yes, July 12th, 53. What does that mean? And then I said, Rob, can you see what's written above it? He said, no, I can't see it. I said, look close. I blew it up, and I had a light bulb moment. It says, EX, period, as altered in pencil, 8/7/52. Okay, let's understand this. The first word that's important in this notation, which is in the same handwriting as the person making the pencil edits, which I believe is Willard Richards, by the way. There's a lot more that needs to be done on that, but in my initial assessment, it appears to be Willard Richards' handwriting. The word altered is, I believe, significant. It doesn't say corrected, it says altered. Now, we could quibble over that as to whether that matters or not. However, the devil is in the details. It says altered, and indeed, as the evidence, I believe, will show, these are alterations, draft edits, not corrections. Well, let's explain the difference, by the way, between copy errors and draft edits. Now, copy errors, when a scribe is copying something, even if they're trying to be very meticulous, they'll make mistakes. There's all kinds of mistakes they can make. I slip. They can invert words. They have all kinds of things that can enter in. But what typically happens is while they're making these copies, especially if they're trying to make a faithful copy, not a sloppy copy, a faithful one, they will notice the error, or someone else will notice the error, and they will scratch it out, put an insertion. They'll correct as they go along. They don't always correct everything, obviously, but they'll try. And in the Richards document and the Kingsbury copy, both Richards and Kingsbury are making corrections to their own writing as they go. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about draft edits. Let's give an example of this. For example, Joseph F. Smith wrote William Clayton's 1874 affidavit, his famous affidavit. By the way, I highly, highly, highly recommend, if you have not read it, please read Crafting a Sacred Story, Joseph F. Smith and the William Clayton affidavits by Cheryl Bruno and Michelle Stone in the Journal of Mormon Polygamy. It's an incredibly consequential and very important paper. It's incredibly important because it helps us understand what would come in the wake of what Joseph F. Smith was doing. Well, part of that was this effort to draft the 1874 affidavit of William Clayton. Well, William Clayton, after Joseph F. Smith in his handwriting writes out the story, William Clayton goes in and he makes certain pencil edits on his own, insertions, corrections, etc. And then all of those edits migrate into the final copy that William Clayton himself drafts and then signs. Okay, that's the distinction of what I mean by a draft edit versus a copy, fixing a copy error. Are we clear? Okay, this is important. It's tall grass, nerdy stuff, but it's important. So, there are about a dozen of these in the Richards that all make their way into the Kingsbury, and there's not a single one that goes from the Kingsbury into the Richards. Maybe that could be explained, maybe Richards. But remember, these edits are being made August 7th, 1852, and if he was correcting the copy, he would have the Kingsbury in front of him. He's the church historian. Okay. The next, EX abbreviated. EX period. This could mean a few things. Most likely, it means exemplar. An exemplar in textual criticism is the text used to produce another text. In the study of the history of a text, an especially important exemplar is that which precedes any split in the tradition of that text. That is before significant textual variations occur in different versions, such an exemplar is called an archetype. The evidence here indicates that the Richards version was indeed an exemplar or even an archetype text used to produce another text. And this was all done, remember, 22 days the edits were prior to August 29th, 1852. Remember, 8/7/52. So this is an exemplar document altered in pencil. Draft edits were made to the document, as we'll dive into here in a minute, on August 7th, 1852, 22 days prior to the revelation being announced for the very first time. This little notation has been there all along, almost hiding in plain sight. So, regarding the story, from Joseph's mouth to Clayton's pen, to Kingsbury's pen, to Newell Whitney's care, to Brigham Young's desk, regarding the Kingsbury document, the evidence we will show today will indicate that the Richards document most likely came before the Kingsbury. Kingsbury swore an affidavit under an oath, and he mentioned the revelation that was read by Thomas Bullock on August 29th, 1852, which was later printed in the Deseret News. Kingsbury said the revelation published in the Deseret News Extra of September 14th, 1852 is a true copy of the original. The evidence presented today will show that Kingsbury was not the source of that document. The version of that Bullock read to the crowd of 2,000 saints on August 29th, 1852, that document, which was printed 16 days later in the Deseret News. Okay, well, indeed there is a truly peculiar provenance related to the Kingsbury document, but also the Richards manuscript. As we get through this, let's remind ourselves Willard Richards was the church historian, a counselor of the First Presidency, an apostle, Brigham Young's cousin, one of his closest friends, and one of the earliest adopters of the plural marriage or spiritual wife doctrine. Keep those things in mind as we examine the Richards manuscript. There are about a dozen pencil edits and one correction in the Kingsbury that we'll examine. The Richards version, remember, it's important, the Richards version that he wrote was coherent. It was a coherent, understandable document prior to the alterations, prior to editing. It's also important to note that these edits or alterations materially change the essence of the Willard Richards document. Now, the first thing to note is it appears that the pencil edits may well have been done by Richards himself, as I mentioned. An initial analysis seems to indicate that the handwriting of the pencil edits is his. More work needs to be done on that. I don't want to state that with definitive certainty. However, if that is him, that actually has implications on the authorship of the document and as well the stewardship of the document. Well, now let's talk about the edits. The second edit in the Richards document changes the word or to the word and. Now here we see something very curious. Can anybody see what's right next to it? This is highly significant. May seem very small, and indeed, on a page it's very small. But why would you do that if you're just correcting the text? The question mark in the edit indicates uncertainty about the editorial choice, rather than confusion over what the Kingsbury document says, as the equivalent Kingsbury text shown below is not ambiguous at all. It clearly reads, "are not made and entered into." If the Richards document was a copy of the Kingsbury text, it's very hard to explain the question mark next to the word "and" in the Richards edit. The question mark most likely indicates editorial concern about optimal word choice. This is an indication, I believe, and proof of an edit. Then the first edit at the very top of the document, we see in the Kingsbury document, at the top of the page, we see the Kingsbury document, supposedly the original source, and one underneath it by Horace Whitney, one of the other copies, and the other below by Richards. In the Whitney copy of the document, in the middle, purportedly created in 1847, the scribe, Whitney, didn't have any problem whatsoever identifying July 12th as the date in the Kingsbury document. So, why 5 years later, and only 22 days before the document was read, was the church historian still not sure what day the purported revelation was received? You see, Richards originally wrote the date as July 10th. May seem insignificant. However, when he recorded his version of the revelation, he originally only wrote July 10th, 1843 as the date. And then when it was edited, the first editor came in and scratched out the 10th and put it as the 12th. But then we have this interesting question mark right before the pencil correction, changing it to the 12th. The question mark in pencil preceding the 12th in the Richards document at the bottom most likely indicates that when the edit was made, the editor, possibly Richards himself, still wasn't sure which date to assign to the revelation. That edit happened on August 7th, 1852, over 9 years after the revelation was supposedly received. Remember that. That's very important. It is extremely significant that this question mark is being inserted at that late date, because undoubtedly, if this were merely correcting the Richards document to conform with the Kingsbury at that late date, there would be no ambiguity whatsoever about the date. Remember, Whitney had already copied, apparently, 2 versions correctly. Willard Richards is the church historian. He has access to every document he wants. He would absolutely have access to the Kingsbury copy. If it had pre-existed this, he could have consulted with as many people as he wanted to. What possible reason is there to put a question mark before the change from the 10th to the 12th unless he were still trying to decide on the date? Well, also notice that someone else came in with pen and formally changed the date to the 12th. That most certainly happened after August 7th, 1852. What does it all indicate? Well, that on August 7th, whoever edited this document, most likely Richards, was not sure what the date was, and then after August 7th, they finally settled on that date. That's the implication. This particular alteration appears to be a clear indication of indecision on the part of the editor about what the date should actually be, and then later settling on that date to have it be the 12th. It's very strong evidence that this is indeed an edit to the document, not a correction to a copy made from the Kingsbury. Because again, if they had the Kingsbury in front of them, this ambiguity would not be expected in a document like this. Also, something to note that's very important. If this were merely a personal copy and trying to correct or reconcile a personal copy, why are there multiple editors putting their hands on this in an official capacity? The 8th pencil edit in the Richards document is very interesting. The Richards document at top reads, "Let mine, handmaid," as if the editor was trying to decide which of the 2 words would land better. The Kingsbury document below clearly reads, "Let mine, handmaid." The fact that Richards left both of the words "my" and "mine" in the document indicates he was likely considering the stylistic implications of the differences between the 2. Even though the phrase "mine handmaid" had already been used 3 times by him previously in the same document. It doesn't make sense that he would have left the word my in his manuscript if he was simply copying the Kingsbury. It's a very strange error to try to have to account for. And if Richards were going off of the Kingsbury, he would have absolutely have no reason to circle my. He would have circled mine and or crossed out my if it were an error that he was correcting. It would appear that the editor selected my by circling it as the word he would choose, which is interesting because it appears that to be a choice to correct the use of the archaic form to the modern form that Richards had previously been using. We'll see instances of this in a minute. And as we see in the Kingsbury, he never used my. As we will see also in the Deseret News, they don't use my. So the fact that they were potentially choosing to update the archaic to the modern indicates that they were still drafting the document, that it was still evolving. Edit 13 is the only true edit altering a word in the Kingsbury document that deserves attention. This is very interesting. The Richards version, which is shown toward the top, reads, I say unto you, as whatsoever you seal, while the Kingsbury, shown toward the bottom of the slide, reads, I say unto you that whatsoever you seal. It's not a substantive change qualitatively, but it matters because if Richards had been making a copy of the Kingsbury document, we would expect this edit, especially on August 7th, 1852. Exchanging the word as for that, to show up as that in the Richards document, and it doesn't. Again, if it were indeed a true copy, this would have shown up at either that time, the time Richards originally copied it, or even at the time of the supposed corrections in pencil, August 7th, 1852. It's important to understand that the change to that in the Kingsbury document is an alteration. In Kingsbury, the black ink text of the word that overwrites the word as originally written in brown ink. This implies that Kingsbury was written after the Richards, and that when Kingsbury was subsequently changed from as to that, this alteration was not carried back into what now appears to be the earlier Richards document. This is further strong evidence that the Richards document was created independently of Kingsbury. The third edit in the Richards manuscript involves the insertion of a 6-word independent phrase and the keys of this priesthood. Now, this error could possibly be the result of a scribe mistakenly leaving out an entire phrase with the verbiage before the change reading normally. Or this could be an attempt to improve the believability of the text by qualitatively enhancing the content. Some important things to consider. This phrase is coherent on its own without anything missing. If this was indeed an error at the time Richards copied it, the copyist, Richards, would normally correct the error on their own at the time, something that large, while proofreading, because it's so big and obvious. Richards doesn't do that. This alteration happens on August 7, 1852. It doesn't lend itself to a simple islip called homoteliaton because it's a coherent phrase. It's a coherent phrase, and there are no matching words on either side of it to explain jumping over the phrase, missing it easily. In the Kingsbury, this is a very apparent part of the text. This would be difficult to miss, although possible, not very likely, especially if you're doing proofreading. It's very difficult to believe that if Richards were copying what he would know would be such an important document, his handwriting indicates that he would not have proofread his copy to check against the original. All of these together indicate this is far more likely to be another pencil edit to the text, altering it, enhancing the text, rather than making a correction supposedly years after the fact. Now, the rest of the edits and alterations of the Richards document in isolation, any one of them on their own, could be explained by a simple copy error. However, taken in context of what I've already shown you, and also the fact that each one of these still does alter the meaning of the document, become far more likely to be true edits and alterations rather than fixing copy mistakes. The 5th and 7th pencil edits in the Richards manuscript insert the words "thee" and "you" into the same underlying phrase, "unto my servant Joseph." Again, these could be the result of a scribe mistakenly leaving out these similar words in the same place in the same phrase twice, or they could be an attempt to improve the believability of the text by qualitatively enhancing the content in a uniform way. These changes shift both instances from the third person talking about Joseph to the second person talking to Joseph. This apparent tinkering with point of view did not end here. Now, the fourth edit in the Richards document changes the phrase, "this is eternal life," to "this is eternal lives." Now, this type of error could be more likely to occur if somebody had read the text to a scribe who transcribed it without being able to read the document itself. As church historian, a member of the first presidencies, most likely, Richards would have had access to any previous pre-existing church history documents that he wanted, including the Kingsbury copy, if it had existed before the Richards document was created. Something important to note, however, is that this mistake, it would be very odd if it were a mistake. See, the phrase, we all know the phrase, "this is eternal life," was not known in the Christian world at the time. The phrase, "this is eternal life," was a phrase known worldwide from the scriptures, from John 17:3, and this is life eternal, that they might know thee to be the one and true God, the only true God, in Jesus Christ whom thou hast sent. In no other scripture do you see eternal lives plural. This is an interesting and novel phrase. It would be odd for Richards to have read and heard the word lives in the Kingsbury document and mistakenly wrote life because it's so novel and unique. Now, edit number 6 in the Richards document is interesting. This change could be merely correcting a copy error. However, the passage here previous to the change read coherently, but meant something very different before the edit was made. Instead of being a correction to an error, it appears more likely to be an attempt to materially change the nature of what had been restored through the prophet Joseph Smith. Originally, the Richards document read that the Lord gave unto, quote, "my servant Joseph an appointment to restore all things." By replacing the word "to" with "and," this alteration attempts to change the restoration from something that was in progress through the prophet Joseph into something that was already completed. If it was already completed, then the church ostensibly had everything they needed. In other words, the change to this text gives the meaning from Joseph being commanded to restore all things at a time and into the future, at that time and into the future, to Joseph having already by that time of the revelation restored all things and passed those things, and was able to pass those things, which would include things like the fullness of the priesthood, keys, etc., on to others. This, of course, was a central component of what Brigham Young and the leaders of the church would claim, which gave them the right to do what they were doing in their practice of polygamy, which was dependent on a fully authorized priesthood. Edits 9 and 11. In the Richards document, bring up the question of consistency. These two edits both enhance the same underlying phrase. "I, the Lord, will," to "I, the Lord, thy God, will," and "I, the Lord, his God, will." The phrase, "the Lord thy God," shows up 9 times in D&C 132. Richards edit number 9, shown at the top of the slide, shows up in verse 56 of D&C 132. This edit actually appears to have been done at the original time that Richards wrote the document. This is interesting and could be explained by a simple correction. However, on August 7, 1852, edit 11, shown at the top right of the slide, shows the same type of correction. The addition of the words "thy God" bring verses 56 into alignment with 7 previous instances of similar verbiage, as well as the same construction again in the following verse 57. From that perspective, Richards edit 11, found in verses 65 D&C 132, fits into the same category. These alterations could have been caused by a scribe mistakenly omitting similar verbiage in both cases, or they could be editorial attempts to bring these phrases into alignment with the many similar phrases found previously in the document. This also demonstrates the likelihood of editing and alteration over time. This next edit has to do with verses 51, 55, and 57 of the Modern Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. It's really very interesting and highly consequential edit that I want to carefully explain. This one is the trickiest, but I believe is actually maybe the most important. It certainly could be viewed as simply correcting an error. However, in light of the explanation I'll give, I believe we can show that this was a profound alteration to the text. Now, it's important to really go through this because this is a complicated section that we need to have some background for understanding it. First, let's read the verses as they are in the modern version of section 132. Verse 51 reads, "Verily, I say unto you, a commandment I give unto mine handmaid, Emma Smith, your wife, whom I have given unto you, that she stay herself and partake not of that which I commanded you to offer unto her. For I did it, saith the Lord, to prove you all, as I did Abraham. and that I might require an offering at your hand by covenant and sacrifice. Then after this verse, Emma is supposed to receive all the women, or allow all the women that are given to Joseph who are virtuous and pure, and that she's supposed to cleave to Joseph and none else. But that if she won't abide the commandment, then she'll be destroyed. Well, verse 55 then reads, but if she will not abide that commandment, this commandment to allow Joseph to have more than one wife, then shall my servant Joseph do all things for her, even as he hath said, and I will bless him and multiply him, and give unto him 100-fold in this world, of fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, houses and lands, wives and children, and crowns of eternal life in the eternal worlds. Emma is then commanded to forgive Joseph of anything he's done, and then in verse 57 we read, and again I say unto you, let not my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands, lest an enemy come and destroy him. For Satan seeketh to destroy. For I am the Lord thy God, and he is my servant. And behold, and lo, I am with him, as I was with Abraham thy father, even unto his exaltation and glory. Okay, so how do we understand this? This is perhaps the most controversial part of the entire Revelation. It certainly has created immense confusion, consternation, and rightfully so, in those trying to reconcile what's being said here. Historians and scholars, by the way, have disagreed over the meaning. Some historians and scholars have looked at verse 51 as an offer by the Lord through Joseph to give Emma an extramarital or sexual partner. Some even speculated it was William Clayton. Others disagree with that and have interpreted this as an offer of property or lands, as is indicated in verse 57. I personally, and the team of us writing about William Clayton, favor that latter interpretation, and that is what verse 51 is really saying, that the Lord would issue a test to Emma and Joseph in the form of an offer of land. To pass that test, Emma was actually supposed to refuse the land. I believe that's the correct interpretation of verse 51. Then, the remainder of the verses indicate that Emma was to allow Joseph to have plural wives, and if she didn't, she'd be destroyed. That she was to forgive him, that if he had failed in keeping the commandment, Joseph was still supposed to do all things for her, even as he hath said, which is interesting, and which is most likely a reference to what was being offered in verse 51, or in other words, the land. In other words, that Joseph was still supposed to give her the land. And then the Lord would bless him with a whole multitude of things, including many, many wives. Well, and in the Kingsbury, of course, and in our modern version, what it then says is that if Emma fails all these tests, Joseph was to not put his property out of his hands, not to give her the land. Is that clear? Okay. But there's something very interesting in the original Richards document. He wrote, and again I say unto you, let my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands, lest an enemy come and destroy him. Now, people can easily say that's just an error, but it actually makes sense. What it's saying in this context is that if Emma failed the test, didn't give him plural wives, didn't do what the Lord commanded, that Joseph was still to do all things before as he had said, which is what it said in verse 55. To reiterate, Joseph was to offer Emma land. She was supposed to refuse it, and if she didn't fulfill the commandment to give him extra wives, he was still supposed to do all things for her, meaning give her the land anyway. And continuing on that line in verse 57, the meaning in the Richards is the Lord again says that Joseph was to put his property out of his hands to give her the land. In this reading, the Lord is telling him to do that twice. Why? Well, it says, lest an enemy come and destroy him, or lest Emma, the enemy, destroy him. This is akin to the Lord saying, turn the other cheek. Agree with thine adversary when thou art in the way with her, for example. This is in keeping with that kind of language from our Lord. And so it actually makes perfect sense for Richards to have written it that way originally. Then why the change from let my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands to let not my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands? Well, as we've shown, these are edits or alterations. These are not simple corrections or errors. So why would Richards be altering the document to read exactly the opposite? That instead of Joseph keeping the promise to give Emma the land, he was then to not give her the land. You know, actually...
I need to pause the presentation for just a moment to clarify something about this business of land being given to Emma. There's an issue in 1843 surrounding a deed transfer from Joseph Smith as trustee and trust for the church to his wife Emma. William Clayton references this in his Nauvoo Journal, Volume 2, or Volume B, what I call the Gap Book. On July 12, 1843, Clayton writes, Wednesday this a.m., I wrote a revelation consisting of 10 pages on the order of the priesthood, showing the designs in Moses, Abraham, David, and Solomon, having many wives and concubines, etc. After it was wrote, Presidents Joseph and Hyrum presented it and read it to Emma, who said she did not believe a word of it and appeared very rebellious. Joseph told me to deed all the unencumbered lots to Emma and the children. He appears much troubled about Emma. Now there's a lot in this, and the next journal entries I'll read that we need to talk about later, because it's not without its many problems. However, here in his journal entry for July 12, 1843, Clayton records that both Joseph and Hyrum go to Emma to read the revelation. Clayton claims that after hearing the revelation read, Emma was very upset. Clayton writes that Joseph then told him to transfer all of the unencumbered lots in Nauvoo to Emma. Then, on the 13th, he writes, Thursday this a.m., Joseph sent for me, and when I arrived, he called me up to his private room with Emma, and there stated an agreement that they had mutually entered into. They both stated their feelings on many subjects and wept considerable. So, on the 13th, Clayton writes that Joseph and Emma have a tearful meeting and that they entered into some sort of mutual agreement. Some have interpreted this entry as a sort of divorce settlement between Joseph and Emma. Then on the 15th, Clayton writes, quote, Saturday made deed for 1/2 steamboat of Maid of Iowa from Joseph to Emma, also a deed to Emma for over 60 lots. Okay, so on the 15th, Clayton records that he wrote a deed for over 60 lots to Emma and 1/2 of the Maid of Iowa. The trouble with this entry is that Clayton actually wrote a deed from Joseph to Emma for over 60 lots on the 12th, not the 15th. That's odd. If he's recording this stuff on the day, and if he's being truthful, why get the date that he wrote the deed that wrong? Well, we'll discuss this problem and the multitude of other problematic issues with the Clayton journals later. However, as we've learned from Michelle Stone's excellent work on the subject, what Clayton doesn't record is that he also created a draft deed from Joseph to Hyrum as well. That deed to Hyrum is also on July 12, 1843. This deed is very similar, nearly identical to the deed made out to Emma. Both have the same date. Both the deed to Emma and the one to Hyrum are for $10,000, and both have many overlapping city lots. It also appears that the deed to Hyrum was created first, and though it was never signed by Joseph, it was at least completed while the draft to Emma was apparently never completed, but was nonetheless entered by Clayton in the Nauvoo Book of Land Deeds, and then after Joseph's death, by either him or a church representative, into the Carthage Registry of Deeds. What is clearly not happening is what Clayton records. The deed transfer does not appear to be a divorce settlement. The deed creation didn't happen on the day Clayton writes it. Emma didn't register the deed in Carthage. Someone else did in 1844. It's not clear if Emma even knew about this deed. It's not clear why the deed was made out to Hyrum and why it was so similar, including having many of the same lots as the deed to Emma. What's more is that after Joseph died, Emma was in tremendous financial straits. To make things worse, the 12, aided by Clayton, tried to take all the property and give Emma all of the debt. After the martyrdom, a highly acrimonious struggle occurred between the 12 and Emma over Joseph's property and papers. What's the point, and how does it relate to what we're talking about in the Richards manuscript? There was a huge contest between Emma and the 12 over property, and all of this potentially relates to the edit that was made to the Richards document on 8/7/52. Now, back to the presentation.
Now that we've got that understanding, this is really important. The issue of land, the issue of property, okay? It may actually help us understand why there was a change to the date. Remember, the first time anyone ever said the date was attached to the revelation was Orson Pratt on August 29th, 1852. Remember, Sufficient evidence has already been shown that the Richards manuscript was most likely a draft. Keep that in mind as I offer the following. You can reject this, but I'm going to offer it. Remember, Richards had originally written July 10th, 1843. So here's a question. Is it possible that he and they, whomever they were working on this, hadn't settled on the date until August 7th, 52? Not even really settled then, but raised a question about it, when they realized they had a document. Actually two, but they had a deed, in particular, to Emma, written on the 12th. They could then incorporate that portion of the story of the transfer of lands to Emma into the draft that Richards was creating. Now, we can't entirely be sure, of course, but that is some interesting information to consider. In summary, I believe that this alteration of the text from "let my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands," which is consistent with the rest of the verses, to the inconsistent "let not my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands," is not a correction of the text, but it's an edit, and a significant one, altering the meaning. The potential meaning, remember the property dispute, not to give Emma scriptural sanction to be able to retain the lands that Joseph had given her. It's just some food for thought. In summary of this portion, everything we've just shown you is strong evidence that what is going on with the Richards document were alterations and edits to the text. They were done 22 days before it was read publicly to the world. The Richards document was an official document by its very nature, with the type of handwriting, by the corrections, the alterations, the edits that were made to it, the punctuation and pilgrim markings, prior to recopying, and especially all of those significant, meaningful pencil edits and alterations that change the text drastically. All of these alterations made to the Richards manuscript indicate it was created before the Kingsbury document, and that the narrative was undergoing substantive changes 3 weeks before the public disclosure of D&C 132. But it's not just the Richards document. It helps us understand what's going on to the text. There is absolutely more. Remember, Kingsbury had said in 1870 that the revelation which was published, which they read, Thomas Bullock read on August 29th, what they published on the 14th of September, 1852 in the Deseret News, is a true copy of the original. Well, is it possible that Bullock read a copy of the Kingsbury? I want to call my good friend Mike Hamill up. He's going to walk us through this so you can stop being bored of my droning voice. Mike, come on.
All right. What got read on August 29th of 1852? So I'm going to read a quote here. It comes from the Joseph Smith Papers Project first. I believe it's a fair representation of the traditional narrative. They say, with the Kingsbury copy as the source text, the revelation was first published in an extra to the Deseret News on 14 September 1852, following the public announcement of plural marriage by church leaders. Later editing for this later publication makes some of the original punctuation difficult to properly identify. Now, real quick, on the note about the punctuation becoming difficult to identify, that is because somebody went through and was revising the punctuation in what appears to be preparation for publication in the Deseret News. That's the conclusion drawn by the Joseph Smith Papers. However, if you were to go and compare the punctuation between the two, there's about 160 differences in the punctuation, but that could also easily be explained by what happened in the print shop. It wasn't entirely uncommon for the printers, the typesetters in a print shop to decide they know punctuation better than those who bring them a manuscript. And so it's very possible that all those differences can be swallowed up by printers in the print shop doing what they saw fit, what they believed fit best. As we're going to do our analysis, though, we want to compare the Kingsbury manuscript against the text that was published in the Deseret News. As we're doing this, I want you to keep in mind that we're only looking for specific meaningful differences in words between the texts. So we're not considering differences in punctuation. We're not considering obvious spelling errors. We're not considering random capitalization that might have been done in one versus the other. Menial, obvious mistakes, the joining or separating of compound words, all those things, we're not looking at those. If we were to, then the number of differences is in the hundreds between the two documents. But moving to discuss, we need to consider a baseline for what can be considered fair errors in the process of typesetting. So human error is always a problem. It will always show up. In that process, here we've got a list of some of the common errors that will happen. You can get misspellings. You can get the changing of a word form, for example, going from singular to plural, or vice versa. You can get the dropping of letters or the adding of extra letters into it. You can get repetitions of words. They accidentally put them in twice. Specifically within typesetting, you can get certain errors like the transposition of two letters, for example, form versus from. You can get it with words as well occasionally. There could also be substitutions, for example, putting in a lowercase n instead of a lowercase h because they look visually similar and typesetters moving along. So the last one up there, the homoteleuton, is important to bring up. That's where you have the end of a phrase finishing with a single word that another phrase also ends with, and there's the possibility that their eyes, as they're going back and forth, they finish up with the first one, they go to their work, they come back, and their eyes jump to the second, and they can omit what is in between those two different instances. So that is another thing that can happen. However, a professional printer's entire career is dependent on their accuracy. Nobody's going to want to come to a printer who can't properly render what's brought to them. So, in considering what might be a fair error rate, we have Royal Skousen's work examining the process of producing the Book of Mormon. And in that, he actually tells us that in the typesetting from the Book of Mormon, or the typesetting of the Book of Mormon from the printer's manuscript, John Gilbert had an error rate of about 1 error every 3,000 words as his average. So that's about 0.03%. That's pretty accurate. In going from the 1876 text of the Doctrine and Covenants to the 1879, Orson Pratt took a copy of the 1876 that was printed in Utah with him when he went to England, and he used that as the base text. The primary difference was he was creating and adding footnotes into the text. However, he did make a few small adjustments to punctuation and so forth in section 132, with only one definitive error, which is he used the wrong form of the word bear at one point. He spelled it B-E-A-R instead of B-A-R-E. That one error was out of a document that's about 3,270 words. That gives him about the same error rate as was had with the Book of Mormon. So that's pretty good. These guys are pretty good at what they do. Now, the Revelation, as it was printed in the Deseret News, does have some typical typesetting errors. The word sealed was misspelled S-A-E-L-E-D. Servants was misspelled S-E-R-V-E-N-T-S. And you have omissions of letters. For example, in the word unto, the O was left off the end. And in the word shall, there is a missing letter L in the text. These are not the things that I'm going to be looking at. But this is an acknowledgement that they did have typesetting errors, just like anybody else, although the error rate was a little bit higher than in the baseline that we established. What we are going to look at is textual variants that amount to 36 different words between the two texts at 15 different points in the text. So first up, this is a paragraph that we're going to look at from the Kingsbury and the Deseret News. We're going to read the entire paragraph in the Deseret News and then read the Kingsbury so that we can compare them to each other and see that both of them read coherently in their different forms. That's important to remember. They're both coherent. If we're talking about these things being a matter of error, you're going to expect that it's going to break the language and no longer make sense. That's the type of thing a proofreader is going to be able to catch and that they're going to fix. So here's the section as we have from the Deseret News. And verily, verily, I say unto you, that whatsoever you seal on earth shall be sealed in heaven. And whatsoever you bind on earth in my name and by my word, saith the Lord, it shall be eternally in the heavens. And whatsoever sins you retain on earth shall be retained in heaven. Now, let's take a look at the Kingsbury. It reads, and verily, verily, I say unto you, that whatsoever you seal on earth shall be sealed in heaven, and whatsoever you bind on earth in my name and by my word, saith the Lord, it shall be eternally bound in the heavens. And whosoever sins you remit on earth shall be remitted eternally in the heavens. And whosoever sins you retain on earth shall be retained in heaven. So let's look at those side by side now. First of all, what jumps out is the entire phrase, whosoever sins you remit on earth shall be remitted eternally in the heavens, is missing from the Deseret News text. Can this be explained by islip or the homoteleuton? Perhaps, but it's a bit of a struggle to use that as the justification. So first of all, remember the Deseret News reads coherently without this. They just happen to be omitting a perfect independent phrase. But second, if you look at the position of the words on the Kingsbury manuscript, if we are going from the Kingsbury manuscript, homoteleuton would say, you are jumping from the first instance of in the heavens, so after eternally bound in the heavens, and your eyes are going to jump to the other instance of in the heavens, which is 2 lines down and on the other side of the page. So it raises a question of, is that likely that your eyes are going to jump to that different of a spot on the page as you're going back and forth to find that? It's possible, but it's unlikely. And furthermore, there are proofreaders who are employed in the print shop to proof the text once it's printed and look for these kind of errors. And that is a rather large error of omission for a typesetter to not catch. Now we have here, right after where the omission takes place, we have the word whosoever being changed to whatsoever. The existence of this particular word variation right after a missing phrase makes the notion that the missing phrase was a matter of homoteleuton even a little more unlikely, because that is just back-to-back errors. That is not great for a typesetter. But further, whosoever is an unusual word. It's a long word, and it was enough of an issue for Kingsbury as he was writing in his manuscript. The first time that he wrote it wrong. He tried to correct it by adding a letter over it, and then he scribbled the whole thing out and wrote it again. That's not visible here, unfortunately. It's on the line above. But then the second one you can see too, that he had an issue with his pen where it bled out as he was writing it. And these things would have provided visual cues to a proofreader and typesetter as they're going through a manuscript that would have naturally drawn their eye to notice the word, notice it's an unusual word that they don't use very often, and that points to them more likely getting the word correct in the typesetting process. But even with those things being the case, if they were to misread it as they're looking at the manuscript, the likely misreading is not whatsoever. The likely misreading is whosoever, as in whoever, as opposed to whosoever, meaning whoever it belongs to. So this is unlikely to be a matter of error and more likely to be a matter of word choice. Also, right before the omitted phrase, we have here where the Deseret News has omitted the word bound in shall be eternally bound in the heavens. Now, it reads cleanly either way. However, once again, this is a missing word right before a large omission, right before another word being changed to a different word. If we are trying to say that this is a matter of typesetter error happening in the print shop, we're talking about some extremely drunk typesetters really screwing up their job. It is more likely, we would argue, that this points to the Deseret News working off of a different text that was not the Kingsbury. It is also important because the content here, as found in the Kingsbury, is present in the Richards document, which suggests that the Deseret News was working off a third independent draft of the Revelation. At the very beginning of the printing of the Revelation, the first sentence in the Deseret News, the opening phrase has a difference. The Deseret News prints, "Thus saith the Lord unto his servant," whereas Kingsbury says, "Thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant." Now, "unto you, my servant," would ultimately become the standard language. Significantly, as we already discussed, there are those two other places in the Richards copy where Richards' original version spoke about Joseph Smith in the third person, and then that text was altered to address Joseph directly in the second person by adding the words "thee" and "you." This suggests there was an editorial pattern unfolding involving switching the Lord from speaking about Joseph to speaking directly to Joseph. What we see here implies then, if that is true, that the Deseret News in its opening phrase is representing an earlier form of the language in its draft than was present also either in Richards or in Kingsbury. Now, we've got this next one here. The Kingsbury document reads, "Abraham received promises concerning his seed and the fruit of his loins, from whose loins ye are, namely, my servant Joseph, which were to continue so long as they were in the world. As touching Abraham and his seed out of the world, they should continue both in the world and out of the world, should they continue. As innumerable as the stars, or if you were to count the sand upon the seashore, you could not number them. This promise is yours also, because ye are of Abraham. And the promise was made unto Abraham. And by this law are the continuation of the works of my Father, wherein he glorifieth himself." Now, in the Deseret News, is very similar, but as we move further along into the text, what we see is he says, "This promise is yours also, because ye are of Abraham. And by this law are the continuation of the works of my Father, wherein he glorifieth himself." Both read coherently. The difference being that the phrase, "and the promise was made unto Abraham," is present in the Kingsbury version and not in the Deseret News. This again doesn't seem to be a simple case of homoteleuton, because even though both phrases may end with the name Abraham, as you can see up here, the two instances of Abraham are at the complete opposite ends of the page, sharing the same line. That is the eye jump that the typesetter and the proofreader would be expected to be making for this to be overlooked in the printing process. So this seems to give us that much more indication that he's working from a different text. So now here we have one. This one can be a little bit tricky. It may not be independently as strong as the others, but it is still interesting, and there are some coincidences that suggest that perhaps this is not a matter of basic human copy error. So here, we talked before about Richards having written eternal life and then changed it to eternal lives. What we see here is this distinction between the Kingsbury and the Deseret News on the term the death or the deaths. These are paired together in the text. This is where it is essentially reiterating what is in the New Testament, where it says, this is eternal life, to know God and Jesus Christ whom he has sent, and then moves on to talking about broad is the gate and wide is the way that leads to the death. In the finalized version of the text as we have now, both of these are in the plural. Is eternal lives, and it leads to the deaths. However, in Richards, one of them was in the singular, while the other was in the plural. And then when we look in the Deseret News, the inverse is true, where the other is presented in the plural versus in the singular. It seems like a strange coincidence for those two errors to take place in that way, but perhaps it's an error, perhaps it is a matter of them still figuring out how they want to present their doctrine regarding eternal life or eternal lives and eternal death or deaths. Now here we have Kingsbury versus Deseret News. We have neither do they abide my law in the Kingsbury, and neither do they abide in my law in the Deseret News. It's a small word to add, but it is a word addition. Adding of new words into a text is not a common error to happen in typesetting. But further, abide my law is a phrase that appears 3 times consistently in the Kingsbury. Whereas in the Deseret News, when that shows up, we have it appear twice as abide my law, but then this one lone instance that is changed for some reason to abide in my law. And it's worth noting that abide in my law is the version that is used in the modern text today. You can see we have the omission of the word connections that was present in Kingsbury. It is not in the Deseret News. It's a little bit of a bigger word, and it does not necessarily look like the words on either side of it, which reduces the likelihood that it's just going to be overlooked by reading the text quickly. It suggests that that word was not present in the version of the text that was used to produce the Deseret News print. We also have new and an everlasting covenant versus a new and everlasting covenant. It's a small word difference, but it seems that the writers of the version of the text that would make it into the Deseret News may have felt that a new and everlasting covenant just read more cleanly than a new and an everlasting covenant. However, the modern text does include the word "and" following the Kingsbury. Here, we've got a little bit of an interesting one where it may, at first blush, look like it's just an update of an archaic word to a modern word, from thine to there. For thine exaltation in the eternal worlds versus for their exaltation in the eternal worlds. The problem with that is that thine is the archaic form of yours, not their. So first of all, if we were to update that cleanly, then it would say, for yours exaltation in the eternal worlds, which suggests whoever wrote the original version that said for thine exaltation didn't really understand the scriptural grammar quite as well as they thought, or that if this was God's language in a revelation, that God didn't understand it very well. But then as we move to the shift in the update to switch from a version of your or yours to instead switch to their is a substantial difference in what the text is saying and how the text is reading, begging the question of, was that a compounded misunderstanding of the archaic language, or was a choice made in a different version of the text? And note that, once again, with all of these, they're all coherent in both of the texts. This is all fully coherent in the Deseret News, and it should not be if these are all errors that are happening. We also have here, I reveal unto you versus I revealed unto you. Okay, there's a change between present tense and past tense. Maybe that's a copy error, maybe that's a choice. We have the keys of this priesthood is conferred versus the keys of this priesthood are conferred. One version is using correct grammar, and again, one version is not. We have all heights and depths versus all heights and depths. That is a difference in the archaic form of the word versus the modern form of the word. And then we have before the foundation of the world versus foundations, and received his portion versus received his portions. It's interesting to note that in the Kingsbury, both of those are in the singular, and in the Deseret News, both of those are in the plural. It's interesting that they keep making all these errors. Now, something else that's important to note is that Kingsbury's version of the text did not remain stable even when it was printed and introduced in the Doctrine and Covenants in 1876. There continued to be alterations to the text even at that time, with 13 total words altered, and 5 of those alterations having an impact on the meaning. It may be worth noting that some of the changes in the 1876 Doctrine and Covenants square with the Deseret News and not with Kingsbury or Richards, suggesting they may have been referencing multiple different pre-existing versions to compile what would come to be the D&C version in 1876. So, the phrase abide in my law versus Kingsbury's abide my law. Keys are conferred instead of Kingsbury's keys is conferred. Heights versus the archaic heights from Kingsbury and their exaltation. That error, perhaps, again, versus thine exaltation. So these usages are the ones that we see in the Deseret News versus what Kingsbury had used. However, with the errors that are taking place, 5 of the errors do have an impact on the meaning of the text. And those alterations in some cases appear to be significant. They show that the editor's words are continuing to change the text. They continue evolving it, and felt at liberty to do so some 25 years after the announcement to the world and the first presentation of this text. Now, there are other versions of the Revelation that were published too. For example, Orson Pratt's 1853 version that was published in the Seer. There's the version that is in the History of the Church from 1856. As you compare all of these, they all appear to have different variations, whether great or small. But in the end, what we find is if we consider the question of Joseph Kingsbury's sworn claim in his affidavit that the Deseret News text was a true copy of the original, that is simply false. While the Deseret News has some textual variants that are plausibly or debatably explained by human error, several are not, and these cast a long shadow on the rest as they're taken together in aggregate. The Deseret News inserts novel language. It alters present language, and it omits 5 full pieces of text, including 2 whole passages, and those omissions are unique among all available texts. That raises the question of, were they omissions that were left out during the typesetting process, or was a text existing that did not have that language in it yet, which the Deseret News was printing from? Well, it appears that the Richards manuscript preceded the Kingsbury. The Deseret News text differs even more from the Richards than it does from Kingsbury's, making the Richards manuscript an even less likely source for the Deseret News. While both of those, the Deseret News and the Richards, do hint at drawing from earlier language and earlier drafts of the Revelation, given this degree of differences, it appears that the Deseret News version did not come from Kingsbury's manuscript nor Richards, but represents yet another drafted version of the Revelation outside of those 2. And even today, the modern text of D&C 132 does not match Kingsbury's, nor the Deseret News, nor the Richards copy.
Thanks, Mike. It's been really fun working with him and with Rob on this, and it's been quite a roller coaster as we've analyzed the documents. I want a few final considerations and I'll wrap up. And what time is it? 8:45? So we're going to wrap as quick as we can. And then those of you who would like to stick around after, if you want to, we'll open it up for a few questions, not a lot, a few, potentially, depending on how long it takes me to get done. So long as you stick to the topic. Let's not go far afield on where's Kolob, because I don't know. Yes, it's way over there. As Amber Lee mentioned previously, very important consideration that I learned from her, and the reason why I asked her to come tonight, was about these meetings that happened. Remember what happened the day before this meeting, August 8th, 1852, was August 7th, 1852, when they were working on the document.
I need to pause one more time to clarify that the information about these meetings comes primarily from David J. Whitaker in his paper, The Bone in the Throat, Orson Pratt, and the Public Announcement of Plural Marriage. Whitaker writes, quote, Pratt also had special occasion to contemplate the matter during the weeks prior to the 29 August meeting when the church leaders submitted Joseph Smith's 1843 revelation on celestial marriage, which dealt in part with polygamy, to intensive discussion. On Sunday, 8 August, for example, 13 of them had listened as Secretary Thomas Bullock had read the revelation, later known as Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, and then had discussed it minutely. Earlier that same day, Brigham Young had told the congregation about the importance of growing by degrees and admonished them not to reject the truth because of their traditions, and cited lengthy notes from Doctrine and Covenants, section 76, a text that Pratt would refer to in his 29 August address. On August 15, church leaders, Pratt among them, again met to discuss the principle of plurality. Again, the information for these meetings comes from David J. Whitaker's article.
So is it possible when these 13 brethren got together and read, or Thomas Bullock read the document of the meeting, as Amberly read to you from J.K. Simmons' master's thesis, which, by the way, was under the advisory under Garrett Dirkmaat, is it possible they were reading the Richards? And so if we remember that alteration happened on August 7th and that these meetings start taking place, we know exactly who was at least in the meeting on the 15th. For example, in that meeting where they discussed plural marriage and the revelation, we see in the journal history of the church, in attendance was Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, Willard Richards, Orson Pratt, Wilford Woodruff, Thomas Bullock, Edward Hunter, Daniel H. Wells, W.W. Phelps, Truman O. Angel, William Clayton, Nathaniel H. Felt, Edwin D. Woolley, my great-great-great-grandfather, and Albert Carrington. These men, as it says, met together in the temple room, prayed in a circle, and conversed about plural marriage. Although he was in town on this date, notably absent from the meeting, was Joseph Kingsbury. The fact that these meetings took place immediately after the Richards document was altered indicates the strong possibility that what they read on the 8th and were discussing during those meetings was indeed the Richards document. They did all of this without the involvement of Joseph Kingsbury. This appears to be further corroboration that the Kingsbury document was not involved at this point, perhaps not even created until after these meetings. One more curious thing to note, William V. Smith noted, pagination on the Kingsbury document was penciled in later by another hand, probably Willard Richards. Possibly someone in the Deseret Newsprint shop, beginning with page 2. So it's very possible. I believe it was Richards. I've looked at his handwriting closely. I think it's his, with the word inside and all those numbers, etc. Could be someone else, but I think it's his. But interestingly also, whenever the Kingsbury version was written, it appears that the initials WR were written on the bottom. As the Joseph Smith paper states, the final page bears the stylized initials WR in graphite, likely standing for Willard Richards. Maybe it's not him, but that's interesting. This may indicate that Willard Richards was signing, or perhaps even signing off on, as church historian, on Kingsbury's document. All of this indicates that Richards himself may have done the final pagination and approval of the Kingsbury document. This is potential further evidence that the Kingsbury document was written after the Richards document. Finally, As Willard Richards died on March 11, 1854, the strong indication that he wrote his initials at the bottom of the page, final page of the Kingsbury document, gives us the outer limit for the date when the Kingsbury document was created. From this evidence, it appears that the Kingsbury document was created no sooner than August 7, 1852, and no later than March 11, 1854. Okay, let's sum up. What we know. The Willard Richards document, edited 22 days prior to Brigham Young's 8/29/52 announcement, has clear material alterations and edits, not copy errors. Those edits all migrate over into the Kingsbury. Nothing goes the other way around. This is very strong evidence indicating Richards most likely came before Kingsbury. The version of the revelation that Bullock read on August 29th, right after Brigham Young, was materially different from Kingsbury and Richards. Those material omissions, additions, and alterations are strong indication that it was most likely a different version altogether from the Joseph Kingsbury and the Richards documents. Altogether, this indicates this evidence undermines the story. From Joseph to Clayton to Kingsbury to Newell to Brigham Young. All of this raises far more questions, however, than it provides answers. Now, we should ask ourselves, if this is indeed correct, which I believe it is, I think we're going to get pushback on it, for sure. But they're going to have to answer some questions. Why is the document official? Why is it his best handwriting? Why is it being altered 22 days prior to the meeting? Why are there a series of meetings happening right before? Why are they lying themselves into oblivion for years prior to the meeting? Why does Brigham Young lie in the meeting right before he announces the revelation? Why is the Desert News so very, very different? Why are they both coherent? They have to answer these questions. It is not for those who are going to try to dismantle this argument as simple copy mistakes. You must answer those questions. You must provide a good answer to those questions. However, there are other questions that are very, very important to answer. There were a number of people who said they saw a shorter revelation. James Whitehead said that he was in winter quarters and Newell Whitney showed him a shorter revelation. It's 2 pages. He said it was in the handwriting of William Clayton. He said it only had to do with eternal marriage. And that later, what he saw later that was printed he said, so altered it as to sanction polygamy when before it had prohibited it or had not sanctioned it. Is that possibly something we should consider now as having some truth to it? William Law said he saw a shorter document. He said the document, when he saw the printing in the newspaper, he said, well, the one I saw was much shorter. It was 2 to 3 pages. But people have looked and they've said, well, there's so much correlation between what's said in the expositor and what they said, what's in 132. Given what we've already shown, that this appears to be going through alterations and migrating between editions or versions of the document, is it possible that there was a different version that was even shorter in the days of Joseph Smith? I remind you, Joseph said he had a revelation. Hyrum read that revelation. That revelation contained substance that we find in D&C 132 about a man marrying a wife, and if they are married by his word, which is his law, and sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise, then and all the promises result. That's the substance of what Joseph preached on July 16th, 1843, which he confirmed on July 10th of 1844. He said, that's what I had the revelation on. Well, is it possible, just possible, and I know this is heresy for people, but is it possible that he was telling the truth? And it would explain so many things. You see, what if it's possible that Clayton did copy that revelation down? The short one. That Newell Whitney wanted a copy of that revelation. Now, by the way, I want to be very clear. I'm speculating. For those who will, rake me over the coals, I'm in the world of speculation right now. But this is how we try to reconcile these irreconcilable differences. Is it possible that Joseph dictated a revelation to Clayton somewhere around July 10th, July 12th? Who knows? By the way, Michelle just pointed out there's nothing written in the Richards memo book that we call Joseph's Journal on July 10th. There's nothing there. Oh, that's interesting. By the way, Willard Richards doesn't even, when he's writing to Brigham Young, in July of 1843, back and forth. Willard's keeping Brigham apprised of all the things that are going on in Nauvoo, because Brigham's back east, by the way, courting Augusta Cobb. Okay? He is. I got a story about Augusta Cobb. And Willard's telling him what's going on. Willard reports the sermon on July 16th, 1843. Doesn't mention the sermon. All he mentions is, Joseph mentioned there's enemies in his own house. Who is it? Could it be Parley Pratt? Could it be somebody else? Could it be somebody else? That's all he mentions about what's happening that day. He doesn't on July 12th, by the way. In his letter to Brigham Young mention any revelation. He mentions a letter later on July 29th, I believe, a revelation in the letter to Brigham Young. He doesn't mention what it is. A revelation was received. He hadn't seen it yet, he says. It's interesting. Well, okay. Possible. Joseph gave a revelation to Clayton, small one, short one, had eternal marriage language in it that we find in D&C 132. Is that possible? And then Newell Whitney wanted a copy. Newell Whitney's Joseph's friend. Is it possible that he said, can I have a copy of that? I would love a copy of that. And Joseph said, not thinking it's a problem to copy this revelation to a friend because he doesn't worry about it getting out and then getting him killed. By the way, George Albert Smith would say, some 200 people saw the revelation. What? Some 200 people saw the revelation. That's what he said. William Clayton said only a few authorities of the day, though no authorities are ever named. There's all these questions that bubble up when we look at the documents. Could Clayton have written one down? Could Kingsbury have made a copy of that? That's possible. Sure, that's absolutely possible. Is it possible that Newell Whitney, by the way, Newell Whitney appears from Clayton's journal to have been a part of what Clayton calls the brethren of the secret priesthood. Okay, that's a strange term. We should learn about that at some point. However, it's possible that Newell Whitney had that in his possession. Is it possible that at that time they made alterations to it? We know we have the happiness letter in the handwriting of William Richards. Actually, well, it's probably Willard Richards. The happiness letter has no possible provable connection to Joseph Smith except for some people who want it to be. Okay? We've got these things going around and accusations happening that are never corroborated during Joseph's life, only corroborated decades later. Well, it's possible somebody had this short revelation. Is it possible that when Hyrum read that revelation to the High Council, which he said he did, that somebody tinkered with that one? And they showed the tinkered one in private, because all the secret polygamy conversations were being whispered about, as Emily Partridge would say, in private. That they showed that to Austin Coles and said, now I'm wildly speculating, they said, Austin, come here. He read you part of the document, but look at this. This is the whole thing. I don't know. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. Of course it is. Is it possible that William and Jane Law saw that short document too? Why did Jane Law never mention the stuff about Emma? If you're going to take down the prophet at that time, the most gut-wrenching stuff in there for maybe a woman would be the fact that the Lord would say, hey, woman, if you don't abide your husband's counsel and take as many wives as he wants, I'm going to destroy you. That's not there. That's interesting. William Law says, what I saw was much shorter. And though they name things in the expositor that line up with what eventually becomes 132, it's missing a lot of stuff. Could this provide answers to that? Okay. I think those are questions that we ought to entertain. We have to be allowed to entertain them. By the way, I'm speaking passionately because I've just gotten through being pummeled because I released an essay. And boy, some people aren't fans of it. That's okay. That's okay, because I've challenged and I'm doing source criticism on William Clayton. I am challenging some things that people don't want challenged. This one is the biggest one, though. So, with all of those questions that are going to linger in the air, what I hope is that this will actually spur people to really look more deeply at this. By the way, if you want to do a comparison between what's in the D&C and what Joseph Smith talked about, Rob Fotheringham does a great video that shows you what lines up between the two. So go watch that. Go to his channel. It's called Joseph Smith Was Not the Author of D&C 132. It'll help you get a real sense for the distinctions. But in the end, what I really believe this means with all the questions it raises, is that the story now has to be re-examined. And I want to make a very humble invitation to historians, researchers, and any interested party to go to work. Let's roll up our sleeves. I think this is too significant to ignore, which has been in some apologetic circles and some antagonistic circles the first tactic. The second one is to mock, to dismiss, to deride. I'm called all manner of things. Okay. But you can't ignore these things. They're not going away. They're here to stay because they're in the documents. And we've spent our lives, as many have spent their time, some time reading secondary sources, we've spent our lives in the last decade, I have for a decade, in the footnotes, in the primary sources. And they reveal a different story. I also would like to humbly call on the church, please. There are some 900,000 records they've released. It's so wonderful. The Joseph Smith Papers is so wonderful, but there's 1.1 million that aren't released yet. William Clayton has a private book that John Nuttall was copying from in 1870-something. Do they not have that? Whereas William Clayton's day book from Nauvoo, from which he most likely recopied his Nauvoo journals. His Nauvoo journals don't line up, by the way. There are 4 different passages that overlap that all say something different. Okay, there's some real issues with these records. So please release all the documents, and please let's continue being more and more transparent and more open to conversation about these things. Well, this has been quite an odyssey tonight. I want to thank you guys. First of all, I want to thank Mike. I want to thank Rob. Amberly, thank you so much. Michelle, thank you for letting me pick on you. I want to thank all those people who have inspired me. Whitney, you have inspired me so much. You paved a trail. You wrote a book when very few people were talking about this, and you took all kinds of incoming fire for it, and it's a fantastic book that should be considered on this subject. She also wrote an incredible book on Hyrum as well that's really worth considering. I want to thank Mark Curtis, by the way, for putting together the first really worthwhile timeline on this subject. Thank you, Mark, and for doing a series of podcasts that inspired me. There's way too many people to thank, but I want to thank Justin in particular and Rebecca. You guys, I can't believe what you do. I cannot believe what you do. Thank you. And so, I want to thank Connor Boyack, by the way. If you see this, Connor, oh my God. He's a brave individual. In a world where there's so much suppression of dissenting voices that challenge convention, why would we do that in Mormonism? Why? With honest seekers of truth. That's what this is. We are not Korihor. Now, I want to speak just 2 seconds spiritually. In these forums, I don't normally, this is an environment for it. I believe in the gospel. I thanked Andy Ehab before because he's foundational for me in my formation of my ideas about Joseph Smith. Because Andy was one of the first people to give us access to a lot more of his words. You see, there are so many people, they run into a brick wall when they think Joseph shagged a 14-year-old. And that story is ridiculous. And I know, and I won't say, but I know that incredible work is being done on that subject, so stay tuned. There is no good evidence for it. As Richard Bushman said privately and even hinted at in his own book, it's a different deal what Joseph's doing and what Brigham's doing. It's a different story. And when people, before they decide to throw the proverbial Jesus baby out with the bathwater, because that's what happens when they believe that the supposed prophet of the Restoration is a con man, and all he wants to do is, hook up with chicks in the barn. That's what happens when we haven't fully addressed these issues. I understand there's a wide range of understanding we can come to about the various documents, but I can tell you categorically that the consensus narrative is just wrong. It's just wrong. What the ultimate narrative should be, I think that's under investigation. So, thank you all so very much for coming, and I can't believe you all came. Thank you. If anybody has questions, I don't know, we'll do, a dozen questions or something. But please, if you have questions, if you would please keep them on topic. We got a question over here, two over here, on the left side. And if you'd state your name and then ask your question clearly, please, that would be great.
Do you have any Jewish or Muslim literature or any literature that Isaac had multiple partners?
No. In fact, that's one of the curious things that people have tried to wrestle with for years. Why is the Lord so terrible, both with his grammar, but also with his conformity to Scripture? I guess the answer would be, well, he's revealing new things. He's just revealing new things. But at least in the biblical text that Joseph altered, Joseph didn't make those corrections. He didn't give Moses extra wives. He did not give Isaac extra wives. And Keturah was not a concubine, nor a plural wife. He was married to her after Sarah died. Yes?
My name is James, and I really enjoyed the presentation by Mike on the typography, and it got me thinking about if it takes all of this mess, to put it bluntly, to create a document of man, Section 132, which we've established for the sake of argument, that's definitely created by man, which you guys did a wonderful job of. What does the paper trail look like for documents that we know and believe were direct revelations from God, including the script for the Book of Mormon? Would there be just as many revisions, rewrites, and cover-ups, or are those pretty clean?
No. There are people actually in this room who are very adept in answering what you're asking about. I don't want to go into it right now, but I can tell you that there has been a recovery, a great effort to recover Joseph's actual words, to redact the additions, the changes, the various things by Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, etc. There's a lot of that's already been done. The documents have been scoured over, and there's a lot we have from Joseph. And by the way, Andy Ehad is one of the people that we can thank for beginning that long ago with the words of Joseph Smith. Next question. Any other questions? Right here.
Okay, you blew my mind today.
Thank you.
I know this is speculation, but in your opinion, why do you think that the Kingsbury document had to be the source? That's the one that they had to claim.
In the realm of speculation, this is pure speculation, okay? Either he was part of the original story, okay? That's very plausible. Joseph dictated to Clayton the short revelation. Newell took a copy, Kingsbury made it. And so, by the way, he may have inadvertently told the truth in 1892, and he said, well, it took me maybe an hour or maybe a half hour. I don't know how long. It was short, basically. Okay, that maybe. Or maybe he didn't participate at all, because James Whitehead said that what he saw in winter quarters, he said he saw the revelation that Newell Whitney had in his possession. He said Newell showed him that revelation. Okay. Let's not just dismiss James Whitehead because we don't dismiss Helen Kimball in 1881 or Emily Partridge in 1892. Okay, he says that, but he said the writing was in William Clayton's handwriting, so maybe that's the case. Well, but we're just speculating. So perhaps, since it appears that the Kingsbury doesn't even exist until after August 7, 1852, possibly they wanted to have someone connected to Newell Whitney. So they asked Horace to make 2 copies, or make a copy. He made 2, and they asked Kingsbury to make a copy. Who knows? That's a plausible explanation that could, I'm being overly imprecise, so like it's just speculation. Who knows? We don't really know, but that's a plausible explanation. They needed to have someone attached to Newell because Newell had the original. He had the short one. Any other questions? We've got a lot of guys in the corner.
So this might be a little more philosophical or existential, but given all of this information, and maybe a little more personal, what does it mean for the current modern church?
In reality, that I think that question is best answered in terms of how we navigate that personally. So for me, when I first came to the conclusion, it was an open question for a long time for me about plural marriage. Okay, this is weird, I don't get it. I believed in it for a long time. I've told this story before. I even had this spiritual inspiration on my mission that this woman that I was talking to would, in the heavens, I would never see her again. In the heavens, she would be my plural wife. It's so amazing. So I used to believe in this stuff. Well, I guess I come from a long line of them, you know. It's in my DNA. And when I first reconciled it, that it didn't just look strange, and I began to think, well, maybe this didn't happen. I'd read a few books. When it finally hit me, this didn't happen. At a certain point, look, I remain open. I know some people don't believe that. I remain open. You show me a document, okay, you show me a document that's proof, I'm going to change again, because I just do that. For me. I change. But I think the most important question is, how do you reconcile it personally? For me, it's one of the best things I've been able to do in my life is to relinquish what I believe is a false tradition passed down by my fathers that corrupted my heart and frankly affected my former marriage. And I don't believe anything good can come from a corrupt tree, so we ought to chop it down.
I just want to say thank you for answering these burning questions that I've had for years. I had this impression we need to go back to those manuscripts and compare, and surely there's going to be some evidence there. But as you were presenting this, I kept going back to remember that the narratives that Joseph Smith was purportedly said he could remember it perfectly, and he just dictated it perfectly from the Lord. And so it just, all of what you've uncovered does not match that narrative.
No, it doesn't, and there's so many narratives. I think actually that this provides a lot of answers for why there is so much confusion. In my paper, I'd written an opening paragraph that documented the number of times people gave different dates for when the original inspiration/revelation came to Joseph Smith, and it's anywhere from 1829 to 1843, and there's a long string in between. You know, why are so many people telling so many different stories? It's because institutional memory is mixing the equation, and it's not true. It's not true. That's the other reason.
My other burning question, in addition to the ones that you've just answered, is, so what are the chances, do we have any ideas where the smaller revelation is? Is there any?
No way to know.
What are the chances
Newell Whitney gave
that turning up somewhere?
Apparently Newell Whitney gave over his papers, or his wife gave over his papers, I believe, sometime after his death. I don't know when. I don't think it was too long. It's possible, but we just don't know. Well, let me give you one example. So, for example, there's a lot of stuff that's out there that people just haven't looked at. So, this one's really incredible. Everybody ought to memorize February 4th, 1862. February 4th, 1862. That's a letter that Augusta Cobb wrote to Brigham Young. It's a very important letter. And to my knowledge, it's never been addressed. I think I was the first one to address it on my podcast, which, because it's in a podcast, people just want to dismiss it. But in that letter, she repeats something that she had said in in 2 other instances. She said, "Where's the revelation?" I'm paraphrasing, but where's the revelation? You promised when we were basically in Lynn, Massachusetts, near Boston. When we were in Lynn, you promised to show me the revelation that was recorded that Joseph had about you and me. She asked him this over a period of like 11 years. She even demands, in the name of Jesus Christ, in another letter, in the name of Jesus Christ and in the name of Joseph, I demand you show me the letter. Sorry, the revelation. And he never shows her, of course, because it didn't exist, but he promised her there was a written revelation. Why don't we know that? In that same letter, she says, "And you made me promise not to see Joseph alone. And I kept that promise, even though I knew in my heart that when I saw Joseph, I should have been sealed to him first thing." Wait, what? Wait, what's going on here? And then she says, "We waited. You said Joseph would come and seal us. And then when he didn't come, you went and sealed us yourself." Why has that never been told? You see, for those of us who do this work, this is why it's frustrating. Because these should be part of the equation. Proper source criticism. The historical method demands that when you have contradictions in the record, they're both acknowledged. They're acknowledged. You don't have to accept both of them as equal, but you got to acknowledge the contradictions. Okay. Well, that explains a lot. There was a lot of talk about a revelation, starting, by the way, in England in 1840. There was a formal revelation that some saints were practicing under called the companion revelation. It authorized a form of spiritual wifery. It appears, in my work, I believe, it establishes in Clayton's own journal that he's part of it. I have a companion piece coming out that will show that there is a lot of evidence linking spiritual wife activity to the apostles. Okay, Martha Brotherton says that Brigham Young said to her that there was a revelation not yet written down. Okay, well, Catherine Lewis says in 1843, some elders came to her, told her that Joseph had had a revelation, and said, "Don't tell anybody. If you do, we're going to deny it." Augusta Cobb said the same thing. "If you tell anybody, by the way, I will tell them you're lying." That's what Augusta Cobb said to Catherine Lewis. Then Brigham Young says to a man on July 9th, 1843, "Hey," the guy asked him, "Hey, has Joseph had a revelation?" Meaning the guy asked him a question because apparently the word's going around that Joseph's had a revelation on having more than one wives, and Brigham confirms it, and he explains the doctrine to him. Okay, so we got a lot of this talk, but the Augusta Cobb letter confirms that the talk is going on, at least that letter, that particular time, is going on without Joseph's knowledge, nor his participation. Okay, well, this starts to explain it. Because he didn't have a revelation on plural marriage. He had what he said he had, which was an eternal marriage revelation. It was short. It contained somewhere between 11, 25 verses-ish. Okay? And somewhere, some people got a hold of it and they altered it. It's that simple. That's the implication. Okay. Are there any other questions before we wrap up?
Sorry, just one more really quick.
We got two more questions.
Just in response to what he said of what we do, it's in Ether 4, verse 6. "For the Lord said unto me, they shall not go," it's talking about the sealed portion of the plates, the writings of brother Jared. "For the Lord said unto me, they shall not go forth unto the Gentiles until the day they shall repent of their iniquity and become clean before the Lord." Amen. What is that iniquity? It's committing blasphemy against God our Father and claiming that he commanded his sons to break the hearts of his daughters. He never commanded that. He has been true and faithful to his word and his commandments. And that we need to basically repent of the blasphemy that we've committed against him and go out and redeem the Lord's vineyard and help other people realize the truth so they can repent also.
Thank you. Final question.
Hi, my name is John Brown. Big fan. From what I understand, one of the narratives is that 132 is kind of the culmination of this kind of slow rollout. Some people compared to like the Word of Wisdom, where it was a good idea, now you should do it, now you really got to do it, now it's a commandment, kind of this slow rollout. Are you aware of any writings, Joseph or Hyrum, or anything where they have a softer statement on polygamy or plural wife?
No.
Like
no.
Abraham had a good idea.
No. Here's what they have. Okay, we have a long string. We have 6 categories. I'll end on this. This is what people don't understand. We have 6 categories of substantial evidence in the contemporaneous record of Joseph, Emma, and Hyrum and their supporters vehemently opposing, fighting, proclaiming against the practice of taking any form of having more than one wife, spiritual or otherwise, in the scriptures, in the legal courts, in the ecclesiastical courts, in publications, multitudinous publications, in private conversations, and in public sermons. That is an incredible amount of evidence that has, to this point, I believe, not been adequately assessed into the consensus, scholarly consensus about Joseph Smith and polygamy. Thank you guys so much for a lovely evening, and I'm really grateful that you came. Thank you.